Chapter 17 of Triumphant Democracy by Andrew Carnegie. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Triumphant Democracy by Andrew Carnegie. Chapter 17, Foreign Affairs. We begin with a quote by Thomas Jefferson: "Peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none." End quote. As we have endeavored to point out, there is a great difference between the old and the new lands in the management of their domestic concerns. This difference becomes radical in the domain of foreign affairs. Indeed, it is no longer a difference, it is a complete reversal. What the old land does, the new land avoids. What the one land does not, the other does in dealing with other nations. The consequences of the two diverse policies are seen in diametrically different results. The huge debt, the constant war, or fear of war, and the international jealousies which surround the parent land contrast strangely with the freedom of the Republic from all these ills. The excuse made by British statesmen for the unfortunate contrast presented is that the Republic has no strong neighbors and no colonies or dependencies far distant from its shores which it is bound to guard. I am persuaded that the cause of difference lies deeper than this. No nation is so temptingly placed as the Republic for being engaged in aggressive warfare. The materials lie around her upon every side. Had America been cursed with monarchical institutions, which ever breed strong military classes, to whom, as to the royal family and the court, peaceful avocations are discreditable as compared with military operations, there can be little question but that the American monarchy would have involved itself in endless disputes, treaties, and entangling alliances with other powers, necessitating large standing armies and fleets, from which would have come endless wars or fear of war. The Republic began early to pursue the paths of peace. The messages of each succeeding president enforced the words of Jefferson, which we have placed at the head of this chapter, and the sayings of American statesmen abound with kindred sentiments. Washington, in his farewell address, gave the keynote upon which all subsequent changes have been rung. He says, quote, "The great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is, in extending our commercial relations, to have with them as little political connection as possible. So far as we have already formed engagements, let them be fulfilled with perfect good faith. Here, let us stop." End quote. Madison's view of the Republic's mission was, quote, "to cherish peace and friendly intercourse with all nations having correspondent dispositions, to maintain sincere neutrality towards belligerent nations, to prefer in all cases amicable discussion and reasonable accommodation of differences to a decision of them by an appeal to arms, to exclude foreign intrigues and foreign partialities, so degrading to all countries and so baneful to free ones." End quote. Adams speaks of, quote, "the pestilence of foreign influence, which is the angel of destruction to elective governments." End quote. Jefferson further lays down as, quote, "our first and fundamental maxim, never to entangle ourselves in the broils of Europe. Our second, never to suffer Europe to intermeddle with cis-Atlantic affairs." End quote. And so was reached the great doctrine, bearing the name of Monroe, declaring to the powers of Europe that, quote, "we should consider any attempt on their part to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety." "Our policy in regard to Europe," the Monroe message continued, "is not to interfere in the internal concerns of any of its powers, to consider the government de facto as the legitimate government for us, to cultivate friendly relations with it, and to preserve these relations by a frank, firm, and manly policy, meeting in all instances the just claims of every power, submitting to injuries from none." End quote. This chapter could be filled with extracts from the President's messages and from other sources, all preaching the same important lesson, that the Republic must be at peace with its neighbors and with the world. I need not, however, dwell upon the past. It is with the present we have to deal. Let me give then a short statement of the course recently pursued by the monarchy and by the Republic in the management of similar emergencies in their relations to other states. The one has a canal through Egypt to guard, and the other a railway across the Isthmus of Panama, that the traffic of the world may be unimpeded. A few months ago, word was received in Washington that a disturbance had broken out at one end of the railway in the Republic of Colombia, and that there was grave danger that railway communication across the isthmus would be interfered with. A force was at once dispatched to the scene, and the admiral sailed under the following instructions, which were published in the newspapers that the nation and the world might see and understand all. Telegram. Navy Department, Washington, April 3, 1885. Rear Admiral James E. Jewett, USS Tennessee, Pensacola, Florida. Quote, in addition to the force under your command in the steamships Tennessee, Swatara, Alliance, and Galena, all of which should be at Aspinwall upon your arrival, you will be reinforced by about 200 Marines dispatched today from New York by the steamship City of Para with tents and camp equipage. To provide for contingencies, further supplies will be sent at once. The duty you are called upon to perform calls for the exercise of great discretion. The object of the expedition is the performance by the United States of their engagements to preserve the neutrality of and keep open the transit from Colon to Panama, and further to protect the lives and property of American citizens. The circumstances as understood from which the necessity of the expedition has arisen are, in general, that a steamship belonging to Americans has been seized at Colon by an armed force, and goods in transit taken from her, her officers and the American consul imprisoned, and the transit across the isthmus interrupted. With the consequences involved in these past acts, you are not concerned. Your sole duty is confined to seeing that a free and uninterrupted transit across the isthmus is restored and maintained, and that the lives and property of American citizens are protected. If, on your arrival at the isthmus, order shall have been restored and the Colombian authorities are adequate to the protection of life and property and the maintenance of the free transit, you will interfere in no respect with the constituted authorities, but report and await orders. You have no part to perform in the political or social disorders of Colombia, and it will be your duty to see that no irritation or unfriendliness shall arise from your presence at the isthmus. The exercise of humanity towards American citizens in exigent distress must be left to your sound discretion. W.C. Whitney, Secretary of the Navy. End quote. Note how careful that promising young statesman, Mr. Whitney, is to limit the operations of his admiral to the maintenance of the free and uninterrupted communication which his government had guaranteed. How solicitous that the authorities and people of Colombia should be so treated that no unfriendliness or irritation could possibly arise. The admiral found upon arrival that the disturbance was over, and soon returned. Not a shot was fired. Now the great point here is that not a voice was raised in all America suggesting that any part of Colombia should be held or annexed, or that the people of that state should be in any way interfered with. Consequently, no suspicions were aroused, no enemies created. American interests were not pleaded as a warrant for continued occupation. The great and powerful Republic was at Colon as a friend of its small and weak sister, but upon no account to interfere with her, even for Colombia's own seeming good. Colombia might manage, or seemingly to America, mismanage her own affairs, as to her seemed possible or best. The admiral would no more have thought of interfering than he would had he been on the shores of Ireland and doomed to stand and see a poor tenant farmer evicted, or upon the shores of Scotland and had seen a poor crofter abused. If the quarrelers in Colombia had attempted to interrupt railway communications across the isthmus, he would have protected that, and in so doing would have received the thanks of all the good people of Colombia. President Cleveland refers to this episode in his recent message to Congress. For the benefit of the unfortunate people of the monarchy, and more especially for that of its statesmen, I quote the passage in full. Quote, "Emergencies growing out of civil war in the United States of Colombia demanded of the government at the beginning of this administration the employment of armed force to fulfill its guarantees under the 35th Article of the Treaty of 1816 in order to keep the transit open across the Isthmus of Panama. Desirous of exercising only the powers expressly reserved to us by the treaty, and mindful of the rights of Colombia, the forces sent to the isthmus were instructed to confine their actions to positively and efficaciously preventing the transit and its accessories from being interrupted or embarrassed. The execution of this delicate and responsible task necessarily involved police control where the local authority was temporarily powerless, but always in aid of the sovereignty of Colombia. The prompt and successful fulfillment of its duty by this government was highly appreciated by the government of Colombia and has been followed by expressions of its satisfaction. High praise is due to the officers and men engaged in this service. The restoration of peace on the isthmus by the reestablishment of the constituted government there being thus accomplished, the forces of the United States were withdrawn. Leaving for the present the Colombian difficulty as peacefully settled, without one trace of dissatisfaction upon the part of the weaker power to plague the Republic hereafter, let us see how the monarchy managed a similar task imposed upon her. England was surprised that a rebellion against the infamous ruler of Egypt had broken out, and being bound with France to exercise dual control, she besought that country to interfere jointly with her in suppressing this righteous uprising of an oppressed people. The government of France was anxious to do so, but the people of France unmistakably pronounced against this, a proof that democracy is beginning at last to show its legitimate fruit there. Instead of sending an expedition to guard the canal, which, by the way, was never endangered, the government sent a large force to Egypt and began an aggressive campaign to prevent the people of Egypt from having such rulers as they desired. From that unfortunate day to this, Britain has gone deeper and deeper into trouble. Already $100 million, 20 million pounds, and thousands of lives have been sacrificed. And for what? Absolutely nothing. The criminal side of the question has so shocked the moral sense of the best portion of the Liberal Party that Mr. Gladstone has deemed it necessary, upon the eve of an appeal to the nation, to confess that the Sudan campaign was a mistake. It was worse than that, Mr. Gladstone. It was a crime which would sully your fame forever were it not known that you had no part in it, but were overruled by the aristocratic element which you thought essential to keep in your cabinet. It may be argued that Britain was bound to interfere and support upon the throne a sovereign against the wishes of the Egyptian people, though this seems a strange position for so advanced a nation to occupy. Or it may be said that Britain had neither right nor wish to interfere with the internal affairs of Egypt, but only wished to guard the canal. It matters not which position is assumed, the fact remains that the policy pursued has not produced the desired result upon either hypothesis, and the end arrived at is in lamentable contrast with the different policy pursued by the Republic. The strong Republic sees clearly from the start what end it has in view, and aims solely for that end. The weak monarchy, ever subject to the popular breeze, the creature of circumstance, can have no decided policy. The British Constitution makes Britain the macabre of nations, always looking for something to turn up. The Republic has complied with its treaty obligations and retired from the scene, with the thanks of its weak neighbor. We are yet to learn what is to be the end of the management of the monarchy. So far, no contrast could be more striking than that between it and that of the Republic. Let us pause here a moment to contrast the positions of the two admirals upon their respective stations at Cologne and Alexandria. The Republican official had every interest in maintaining peace. The responsibility of firing a shot was appalling. Behind him stood his superior, the Secretary of the Navy, every line of whose cautious but explicit instructions seems to regard hostilities with aversion. Behind the government, the admiral knew, stood the American people, loath to hurt the feelings of a weak neighbor and determined never to interfere with its internal affairs. No possible reward, no glory would fall to this admiral from entangling his country in war. He would have been held to the strictest accountability for every drop of blood shed, and the verdict of public opinion at first would have been disposed to go decidedly against him. On the other hand, the surest mode of earning the thanks of Congress and of his country was so to conduct himself so as to secure peace without firing a shot. So stood Admiral Jewett, a man of war converted into a messenger of peace. This is the attitude of the democracy. How was it with Admiral Seymour, the servant of a monarch? Let him refrain from bombarding from behind his iron walls the few miserable defenses in Alexandria Bay, and never in his history perhaps would such an opportunity occur again to rescue his name from obscurity. If he decided to be patient and remain at peace, half pay and oblivion would be his reward. He knew that if he began to bombard the Egyptian defenses, the ruling class, which alone could reward him, would applaud. Even the Queen, a woman who should shudder at war and not publicly parade her interest in slaughter, would publicly congratulate him, and the Prince of Wales and all the aristocracy which move round the court, together with the military and naval classes who flourish only through war, would extol him to the skies. The government tempted the man to fire. All the forces behind him urged him on, while, as we have seen, all the forces behind the Republican admiral held him to peace. Admiral Seymour might have thus reasoned, "Negotiate this trouble peacefully. I remain poor and obscure. There is no danger. I am perfectly safe behind these iron walls. Just open my guns, and fame and honor and rank and wealth are mine." He yielded. Mr. Gladstone himself stood up in Parliament and advocated a peerage and a pension to the admiral who was bribed to begin the bombardment of Alexandria. Fortunately, not even Mr. Gladstone could force the Liberal Party to grant the pension. Admiral Seymour received in cash his 30 pieces of silver. Fellow countrymen, what would you think of a judge upon the bench deciding his own cause, where a verdict for the defendant meant to the judge obscurity and half pay, and the verdict for the plaintiff meant a peerage and £25,000? Yet this was precisely the position of Admiral Seymour at Alexandria, and it is practically the position occupied by every British commander to whom is committed the issue of peace or war in the exercise of his discretion. Need we marvel that while the monarchy becomes involved in war after war, the republic settles similar problems in peace and with the goodwill and cordial friendship of the power with which she has to deal? Let us proceed just a step further and show the policy of the democracy upon this subject of intervention or complications in the affairs of other states. The President's message from which I have just quoted refers to a treaty offered by Nicaragua, which proposed to give America the necessary land upon which to construct a canal of its own across the isthmus, a tempting bait this to a monarchy with imperial ambitions. But listen to the response of the Republican president. Quote, "Maintaining as I do the tenets of a line of precedents from Washington's day, which proscribe entangling alliances with foreign states, I do not favor a policy of acquisition of new and distant territory or the incorporation of remote interests with our own. The laws of progress are vital and organic, and we must be conscious of that irresistible tide of commercial expansion which, as the concomitant of our active civilization day by day is being urged onward by those increasing facilities of production, transportation, and communication to which steam and electricity have given birth. But our duty in the present instructs us to address ourselves mainly to the development of the vast resources of the great area committed to our charge, and to the cultivation of the arts of peace within our own borders, though jealously alert in preventing the American hemisphere from being involved in the political problems and the complications of distant governments. Therefore, I am unable to recommend propositions involving paramount privileges of ownership or right outside of our own territory, when coupled with absolute and unlimited engagements to defend the territorial integrity of the state where such interests lie. While the general project of connecting the two oceans by means of a canal is to be encouraged, I am of opinion that any scheme to that end, to be considered with favor, should be free from the features alluded to." End quote. Statesmanship in Britain would have required some lifelong diplomat to negotiate for the privileges offered, and the seed of many serious questions of the future would have been laid, the abused people of Britain being led to applaud the strong statesmen who had promoted British interests and enlarged the bounds of the empire. A little common sense in the democracy ensures the republic a continuance of peace. But now and then the seeds of future trouble present themselves in more specious garbs. The Congo Basin attracts attention at present, and here is a paragraph bearing upon that subject, also in the same President's message which I have quoted. Quote, "A conference of delegates of the principal commercial nations was held at Berlin last winter to discuss methods whereby the Congo Basin might be kept open to the world's trade. Delegates attended on behalf of the United States on the understanding that their part should be merely deliberative, without imparting to the results any binding character, so far as the United States were concerned. This reserve was due to the indisposition of this government to share in any disposal by an international congress of jurisdictional questions in remote foreign territories. The results of the conference were embodied in a formal act of the nature of an international convention which laid down certain obligations purporting to be binding on the signatories, subject to ratification within 1 year. Notwithstanding the reservation under which the delegates of the United States attended, their signatures were attached to the General Act in the same manner as those of the plenipotentiaries of other governments, thus making the United States appear without reserve or qualification as signatories to a joint international engagement imposing on the signers the conservation of the territorial integrity of distant regions where we have no established interests or control. This government does not, however, regard its reservation of liberty of action in the premises as at all impaired, and holding that an engagement to share in the obligation of enforcing neutrality in the remote valley of the Congo would be an alliance whose responsibilities we are not in a position to assume, I abstain from asking the sanction of the Senate to that general act." End quote. The President does not even consider it worthwhile to submit the question to the Senate. It is so manifestly opposed to the traditions of the democracy, whose business is to mind its own business and teach by example, not by interference. The sanction of the Senate not having been obtained, of course the action of the mistaken delegates is of no effect, and the Republic lets the imperial nations involve themselves in dangerous alliances upon the Congo. We are soon to hear, no doubt, of disputes between these nations upon this very subject. When these arise, the Republican method can be once more referred to with satisfaction. I have mentioned 3 questions, all occurring in 1 year, through any one of which future wars might have arisen, had the Republic not known better than the monarchy how to manage its foreign affairs. No, my readers, it is not because America is so happily placed as to be excluded from the necessity of interference, or that she is not bound by guarantees and alliances with other powers, or freed from the necessity to engage in wars as other nations do, but as the instances just cited abundantly show, her envied position is the natural result of a resolute refusal to adopt the measures which must and always do lead inevitably to wars. The democracy does not escape these terrible catastrophes by luck, but by careful adherence from year to year, and in every emergency to a sound policy. The American people are satisfied that the worst native government in the world is better for its people than the best government which any foreign power can supply. That governmental interference upon the part of a so-called civilized power in the affairs of the most barbarous tribe on earth is injurious to that tribe, and never under any circumstances whatever can it prove beneficial either for the undeveloped race or for the intruder. They are further satisfied that in the end, more speed is made in developing and improving backward races by proving to them through example the advantages of democratic institutions than is possible through violent interference. The man in America who should preach that the nation should interfere with distant races for their civilization and for their good would be voted either a fool or a hypocrite. Such a classification need not be confined to this side of the Atlantic. There was nothing unkind in Mr. Leonard Courtney's policy of allowing the Egyptians to stew in their own juice. This policy would have been permanently best for them. Mr. Courtney was the true statesman. We ask careful readers to reflect upon what has been here shown, and consider whether the success achieved in the management of domestic questions is not admirably supplemented by the wonderful results attending the foreign relations of the democracy. To the people of my native land, I say, do not believe your statesmen when they attempt to excuse their failures and their follies by stating that the Republic escapes similar results because isolated from other nations, while Britain is not. This is not true. The Silver Streak should act as an isolator more complete than any republic has, for the Republic has no such barrier either north or south. It is not further isolation which is required, but a government isolated from monarchical and aristocratical influences. When this is obtained, there no difficulty will be found in the way of adopting the policy of the Triumphant Democracy, which avoids all entangling alliances, since the ally of one nation necessarily proclaims himself the enemy of others. Britain will then stand as the Republic stands, the friend of all nations, the ally of none. The lesson which the democracy teaches the monarchy is that proper attention to its own affairs and freedom allowed to other nations to manage theirs in their own way is the best and surest means to secure progress in political development throughout the world. Thus saith the democracy. No nation can give to another any good which will compensate for the injury caused by interference with the sacred germ of self-government. End of Chapter 17, Foreign Affairs.
Chapter 18, Part 1, of Triumphant Democracy by Andrew Carnegie. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Joanne Turner. Triumphant Democracy by Andrew Carnegie. Chapter 18, Part 1, The Government's Non-Political Work. Quote, politically and socially, the United States are a community living in a natural condition and conscious of doing so, and being in this healthy case and having this healthy consciousness, the community there uses its understanding with the soundness of health. It, in general, sees its political and social concerns straight, and sees them clear, unquote. Matthew Arnold. The man of ability in Britain is too often tempted into the political field. The rare talent for organization and administration of the American, on the other hand, usually finds a far more useful field in the management of affairs, much more important than politics, in a land which has finally settled all fundamental political problems, and now rests at peace upon the rock of the political equality of the citizen, while the parent land is tossing about upon unruly seas, knowing no rest. I have often admired the various non-political bureaus at Washington as being strictly American, something which the democracy has evolved far superior to any similar bureaus ever produced by monarchical forms of government. This is probably the ablest and purest service in the world. I had intended to visit Washington to examine the various branches of this work and write an account of them, but the time could never be spared. The happy idea occurred to me to send my secretary, Mr. Bridge, to perform the task, with a request to write up the subject and see what he could make of it. He has done so well that I cannot do better than incorporate his account, which is as follows. One of Matthew Arnold's clear-thinking Yankees has said with epigrammatic brevity that whenever three Americans get together, they organize. One becomes secretary, a second treasurer, and the other a standing committee of one to watch the executive. And surely this is more than a saying. A people trained to govern itself, even in the most minute affairs of local life, must, of necessity, develop a great capacity for organization and administration. Thus we find in America that groups of men with allied interests invariably have an organization to watch over the common weal. But for organization of the completest and most comprehensive character, it is needful to see what the federal government is doing at Washington. A visit to the numerous departments and bureaus there is like a journey with Alice in Wonderland. There in offices, some dingy, some magnificent, one may see, lying on tables or on shelves, the charts which indicate in every particular the nation's life and health, its pulse beats and respiration, its changing appetite and desires. Nay, the whole world, the universe itself, is told to put out its wrist that the experts may know how it is doing. The present condition of crops in California or in Egypt, the degree of cloudiness in Dakota or Maine, the number and condition of hogs in market at Kansas City or in transport to Chicago, the appearance of grasshoppers in Georgia, the wheat in store at Duluth or New York, the number of bales of cotton at Bombay or Mobile, the present position in mid-Atlantic of a waterlogged wreck or a buoy adrift, a drought in Arkansas, the southward flight of cranes in Dakota, the change made yesterday in the revolving light in the Bay of Nagasaki, Japan, the coal at present available for ships at St. Helena, the relative cloudiness of the planet Mars, these and 1,001 other matters, as diverse as can be imagined, are noted, docketed, and labeled, every change being recorded almost as soon as it takes place. Let me give an example. The Agricultural Department has in its service about 10,000 persons, dispersed all over the continent and a few throughout the world. Their service is mainly voluntary. From their reports is compiled a monthly record, which is exhibited in chambers of commerce and published in newspapers, giving the area and condition of crops throughout the world, cost of transportation to home and foreign markets, prices prevailing on farms and in principal cities, stocks on hand, requirements of consumption, sources of supply, etc. Thus, the American farmer or merchant can always ascertain the amount of acreage in particular crops, the condition of the crops as regards growth, maturity, and probable yield, the number and local value of horses, cows, sheep, oxen, or other cattle, the prices of labor in different localities, or any other data bearing on his work. Further, seeds are distributed and planted all over the vast continent, and the results of differing soils and conditions carefully noted, and deductions drawn as to the appropriate environment. Then, the habits and life history of insects and birds injurious to vegetation, and the best means of destroying them, are subjects occupying the attention of a separate division of the department. In this work, specialists are at work in the field and laboratory, and the results of their labors, printed in special reports, are dispersed by the numerous local agricultural societies and institutions with which the department is in intimate communion. In its own garden, the department cultivates new varieties of fruits and plants for dissemination throughout the country. In this garden, Chinese sorghum or sugar cane was first grown in America, and the Chinese yam was introduced by the same means. The tea plant is another example, and the domestic product is largely consumed by the families who raise it. A Western orange planter writes to the department, "The Bahia orange sent to California 10 years ago is conceded to be the best variety produced in this state. It is the largest size and finest flavor, and sells higher than any other kind. It is worth to California all that the Department of Agriculture has ever cost the country." Amongst other work of the department may be named the analyses of grains and fruits to determine their nutritive value, and analyses of soils and fertilizers, the microscopical study of plant diseases, especially fungi, the diffusion of knowledge concerning the uses of forest trees in relation to agriculture, the investigation of specific diseases amongst cattle, and efforts to prevent or cure. In brief, everything that relates directly or even remotely to farming comes within the scope of the agricultural department. So complete is its supervision that one examining its work is impelled to the belief that the American farmer has only to follow his instructions, and the government department will run his farm and see that it pays. The United States Signal Service is another great organization which, by its electric veins spread over a continent, receives crude material, assimilates it, and sends it back pulsating in a rich, life-giving stream. From Cape Breton Island to southern Oregon, and from San Diego, California to Havana, an area 3,000 miles long by 2,000 miles wide, embracing 150 intermediate stations, messages are simultaneously flashed over the wires to Washington twice a day, reporting all atmospheric phenomena. An hour afterward, the little room of the assistant signal officer in G Street, Washington, holds in its dingy precincts a chart which indicates barometric pressure, direction and velocity of wind, temperature, dew point, rainfall, and cloud areas of every part of the 6 million square miles covered by its network of telegraphs. A stranger dropping in at midnight of January 9, 1886, would have been told that local snows were falling in the lake regions, that the temperature had risen in the Gulf states, and that the rivers had risen a foot at Cincinnati, Cairo, and Memphis, and fallen 5 feet at Chattanooga, that cautionary offshore signals were exhibited from Wilmington to New York, and cautionary signals from New Haven to Eastport. He would probably have been shown the track of the storm which brought to Washington the lowest barometric reading ever seen there, and the chart, being prepared under his eyes, would show him the same storm disappearing into Labrador. A few hours later, the finished chart, reproduced by telegraph, would be in the office of every important newspaper, every post office, thousands of railway stations and chambers of commerce throughout the land, from San Francisco to Boston, and from Minneapolis to Key West in the Gulf Stream. The people of New England would know on receiving the morning paper that for the next 32 hours they were to have cold, fair weather with a rising barometer, while those of Los Angeles in Lower California and Jacksonville, Florida, would be gladdened to know that the cold wave was passing away. In Minnesota, railway officials would learn by the same report published in their newspapers or hanging in the ticket office that there would be no immediate need of snowplows, although traffic would be slightly impeded by local snows. The skipper who contemplated leaving New York and sailing coastwise would hesitate on reading at the breakfast table that cautionary signals were displayed, and, influenced by the report of some army surgeon or amateur meteorologist away in Dakota, he might possibly decide to spend another day at home. All sorts and conditions of men are affected by this chart. One postpones a journey. Another, calculating on the arrival of grain in eastern cities, sells before the market falls. Emigrants decide to go west by the Southern Pacific route. Physicians relax their restraints as the improving weather admits the invalid to the fresh air. An amusing illustration of the extent to which the warnings of the Weather Bureau are read and heeded was lately afforded by a mistake made by a Western observer in his report of local temperature. He reported about 40 degrees instead of 4. The result was that the officer who makes the predictions concluded from his data that a warm wave was on its way east. 30 million of people living east of the Mississippi forthwith left overcoats at home and put on galoshes in preparation for a thaw which never came. The unlucky weather prophet at first excused the tardy arrival of the warm wave by saying that Western railways were blocked with snow and arrivals of all kinds were delayed. But as the days passed and no warm wave appeared, the newspapers launched forth an avalanche of ridicule, the American's mode of complaint, at the untruthful prophet, and presently everybody in America was talking about the young lieutenant in Washington, who, oblivious to complainings and ridicule, went on drawing his isobars and isotherms and making his calculations and predictions. It implies great faith in this weather prophet when people complain that he ought to have corrected the error made by the local observer in Colorado or Nevada. It has come to this, that the weather prophet must not only predict correctly from his data, but even correct the data if these are wrong. Considering the haste with which the weather charts and predictions are prepared, it is surprising how few errors are made. 83% of all the indications made last year for the Atlantic coast were justified, while on the Pacific, The verifications averaged 87%. Of 2,864 cautionary signals displayed at ports, 2,301, or 80%, were justified. Cold wave signals were justified in about the same proportion, 815 out of 946 having been verified. The Signal Service engages in much special work. It furnishes the Farmer's Bulletin with meteorological information that is of special interest to the agriculturist. This is an official publication, and the government has taken every available means to put it into the hands of the class for which it is intended. The rise and fall of rivers are watched, and timely warning given by telegraph of coming floods. The people of the Western Plains receive similar warning of the approach of local storms, and the agriculturalists, ranchmen, and others generally have 12 hours to prepare for the coming norther. The Bureau has also undertaken the task of announcing the coming of locusts, grasshoppers, and other insect scourges. Frost warnings for the benefit of the sugar industries of Louisiana and the orange growers of Florida have, of late years, made the service popular in the South. The Bureau has a very complete local service in the Cotton Belt, which supplies information daily as to temperature and rainfall in every part of the district. Then, once a month, the service publishes a review of meteorological observations made in every part of the world, including Siberia, Greenland, Iceland, Borneo, Turkestan, Japan, China, and some places whose names are suggestive only of desolation and savagery. An important extension of the Signal Service has been made to the seacoast. Stations are placed at intervals along the coast and connected by wire with each other and with Washington. Here, storm flags and danger warnings are made visible to vessels moving off the coast. A ship sailing from the equator to New York, as she passes Cape Henlopen, may inquire by signals whether any hurricane is impending, and, if so, whether she has time to reach Sandy Hook or must take shelter behind the Delaware breakwater. Or a vessel bound south from New York may inquire at the capes of the Delaware whether any storm is likely to strike her before she can make Cape Hatteras, and receive full answer by telegraph from the chief signal officer at Washington without interrupting his voyage. General Hazen, the chief signal officer, very properly thinks this division of his work of superlative importance. He says, "The time is not far distant when the possession of a coast not covered by seacoast, storm signal, and signal service stations, watching as sentinels each its own beat of sea and shore, and ready to summon aid by electric wires, will be held as much an evidence of semi-barbarism as is now, among civilized nations, the holding of any national coast without a system of lighthouse lights." The achievements of the Signal Service are surprising even to those who know of its numerous observing stations spread over a land area nearly twice as great as that of Europe. But what shall we think of similar achievements on the ocean? If we are amazed at the extent of meteorological observations conducted on land, what will be our feelings on learning that similar work is being done on the sea, and predictions given for use of mariners? I have before me a remarkable chart prepared by Commander Bartlett of the Navy. And here mark the difference between a government by the people and a government by a class. Naval officers in America do not receive their highest rewards for bombarding a defenseless Alexandria or sacking a Tamatave. Their honors flow from life-saving services. And shall it not be said that the Schleys and Bartletts of America are greater than the Seymours and de Courcys of semi-civilized Europe, whose glory is to slay? The European method is to make a solitude and call it peace. The American reverses the process, and by the gentle arts of peace makes a teeming city of the solitude and a garden of the wilderness. To return to the chart, however, here at a glance we have the safe transatlantic route, carefully drawn to avoid the ice, which in January hardly came further south than latitude 53 degrees. The sailing route to the equator, calculated to give ships the benefit of the trade winds, is also as clear as careful drawing and good printing can make it. The prevailing winds for the month are indicated, as well as the direction of ocean currents, while special symbols mark the position of wrecks, buoys adrift, waterspouts, and localities haunted by whales. Directions for the use of oil in heavy seas are printed in the corner of the chart. Derelicts drifting about in the tracks of vessels are observed, and their changing position marked from month to month. Here, for example, is a waterlogged schooner, the 21 Friends, which, despite its name, has been more threatening than 21 enemies. The vessel was abandoned off the coast of Virginia on March 24th. Being lumber-laden, she continued to float, and by April 28th had drifted 1,200 miles. During the summer months, she pursued her solitary course across the Atlantic, ever followed by watchful eyes in Washington. On September 20th, she was apparently making for Queenstown, but suddenly headed off for Cape Finisterre, where she was seen early in December. She has probably ere this been towed into a Spanish port. Several other floating wrecks have been watched by anxious eyes in the Hydrographic Office, which, unable to send out and destroy such dangers in the track of commerce, could only give warning by indicating as nearly as possible their position. This wonderful chart is soon to give the position of fogs in the North Atlantic. Thus, the ferry between the old and new lands is ever being made safer. The weather predictions are, of course, only proximate, being largely based on the periodicity of meteorological changes in the North Atlantic. Here are examples of the weather indications given, copied from the chart for January 1886. The storm area on the North Atlantic is at its maximum. Between the coast of the United States north of Cape Hatteras and that of Europe north of 47 degrees, a gale of wind may be expected once in 6 days. These gales are most violent when the wind is between southwest and northwest, but a large percentage do not develop a force of more than 10. Heavy northers may be expected along the Gulf Coast of Mexico and Texas as often as once in 10 days. Some may extend as far east as Key West and south over the Caribbean Sea to Aspinwall. There is little danger of ice in the routes of transatlantic steamers. And then come recommendations in regard to passage off Cape Horn, which admirably show the deductive methods of modern weather prophets. In the summer season, that is, during the long days, there exists a barometric minimum over the vast plains of Patagonia. In consequence of the constant in-drift due to this atmospheric condition, the centers of depressions which travel from the Pacific to the Atlantic are deflected toward the north, causing violent storms in the region of Cape Horn and Tierra del Fuego. It is therefore desirable, after passing Staten Land, to stand to the southward as rapidly as possible to the 59th or 60th parallel, if the ice permits, where the influence of the navigable semicircle of the atmospheric whirl will be felt, in which relatively light northeast and southeast winds prevail and are favorable for making the passage into the Pacific. Here's fine revolution, and we had the trick to see it. The Fuegians, who live in this inhospitable region, believe, as Fitzroy tells us, that storms are sent by evil spirits to punish the wicked. And here, Captain Bartlett, with unconscious iconoclasm, says their cause is only a barometric minimum in Patagonia. These scientific experts are rapidly taking all romance out of life with their classifications and technical phraseology. If the Fuegians get a sight of Captain Bartlett's chart, they will at once become a religionless race, for it is obviously vain to attempt to propitiate a barometric minimum. The monthly publication of this encyclopedic chart is but a small part of the work of the Hydrographic Office. Branch offices are maintained at the principal ports to give information to mariners concerning routes, to adjust barometers and chronometers, to examine old charts and point out their errors. Nearly 11,000 persons received nautical information last year from the officers under the hydrographer, and nearly 12,000 vessels were boarded and information collected from their logbooks. Then, every week, notices to mariners are published and circulated all over the world, announcing changes in lights, buoys, and everything affecting navigation, whether at Kodono-Saima, in the Japanese Inland Sea, or in the Swash Channel at New York. The enormous work entailed by this may be gauged from the fact that there are about 20,000 buoys in the world, and every change in color or position is immediately reported to the hydrographer, who at once announces the change to every American consul and to hundreds of mariners throughout the world. So too with the lighthouses of the world, which are so numerous that a list of them fills 6 volumes of nearly 300 pages each. This list, by the way, was compiled in the Hydrographic Office, and 20 days after receipt of the copy, a 300 edition of this 6-volume work returned from the government printers, ready for distribution in the Navy. In this office, the Navy's store of charts is kept, and every change referred to above is made on these charts by hand. The office likewise prints a great many charts itself, and of these, the plates are regularly corrected to date. Altogether, this Hydrographic Office is one of the wonders of Washington. If it were better known, it would probably be more subject to the invasion of sightseers at the Capitol than the Washington Monument. But it goes quietly along, working out its own salvation and that of thousands of poor sailors who never heard of Captain Bartlett, the cherub that sits up aloft to take care of the life of poor Jack. In the same building is the Office of Naval Intelligence, where a chart is published indicating from month to month the supply of coal at all the coaling stations of the world, and also the means of telegraphic communication accessible to mariners wherever they may find themselves. In natural sequence should here come an account of the life-saving service, which in America is not an institution supported by voluntary contributions, as in England, but is a department under the government. As a result of this difference, it is claimed that the American service is more efficient than that of Britain, that a discipline almost military in its severity is necessary to obtain the best results where groups of men are working under the conditions usual at wrecks. This is a healthful and worthy rivalry. Let this be the only form of contention between the mother and her child land. Details of this excellent organization are not called for here. Lord Salisbury's encomium is as applicable to the life-saving service as to the Senate, marvelous in its efficiency and strength. End of Chapter 18, Part 1. Chapter 18, Part 2 of Triumphant Democracy by Andrew Carnegie. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Triumphant Democracy by Andrew Carnegie, Chapter 18, Part 2, The Government's Non-Political Work. An important work done by the United States Army is the improvement of rivers and harbors. Here again, under Republican institutions, the profession of arms has been turned to noble account. To do battle with shoals and snags would be considered poor work for the Burnabys and Hobarts of Britain, but in the Republic it has ever been held that to save life is a higher function than to destroy it. Great America's army, no larger than that of insignificant Romania, is set to battle with nature, not with patriotic barbarians defending their own land. In the signal service, in the improvement of rivers and harbors, in the surveys of Western territories, the Republic finds for her soldiers work which, while injuring no nation, brings them honor and the country security and comfort. So extensive is the work done by the little army of the Republic that in this division of rivers and harbors improvements alone, the year's report covers over 300 pages. Upward of $100 million have been spent by the Engineer Corps on rivers and harbors since the beginning of the government, and the present annual appropriation for this purpose is still very large. The Lighthouse Board, the division of the Treasury Department, has also done much important work in a like direction. It has control of 900 lighthouses and lightships, 1,000 beacon lights on western rivers, and more than 4,000 buoys, fog signals, and other minor aids to navigation. It employs 2,500 lightkeepers, crews of lightships, etc. Here again, American ingenuity is conspicuous. Many dangerous reefs are marked by a whistling buoy which can be heard more than 15 miles. The rougher the sea, the louder this automatic siren sends out its warning voice. This Yankee notion has been adopted by Europe. Still tending to the facilitation of commerce is the Coast Survey, a division which has supplemented its regular function by much special scientific work. It has originated methods of determining longitude, explored the Gulf Stream, solved the problem of tides in the Gulf of Mexico, where only one tide occurs in 24 hours, studied the laws governing tidal currents and the best methods of controlling them so as to aid navigation by deepening channels, and achieved many other valuable results. The international fisheries exhibitions in London and Berlin have given a European renown to the work of the United States Fish Commission. At the closing of the London exhibition, the Prince of Wales stated that, "In many things pertaining to the fisheries, England is far behind the United States." And Professor Huxley has expressed his belief that no nation has comprehended the question of dealing with fish in so thorough, excellent, and scientific a spirit as that of the United States. The Reverend W. S. Locke Sherma of Newlyn, England, has made a trite comparison. At the Paris exhibition, he considered Europe as a man in full vigor, Asia as a decrepit old man, America as a boy, Australia as a baby. In the present fishery exhibition, the case was different. America was the gem of the exhibition. That these encomiums were justified is proved by the fact that at London, the United States exhibit secured 50 gold medals, 47 of silver, 30 of bronze, and 24 diplomas. At the Berlin exhibition, America again headed the list, securing 6 gold medals out of 10. No wonder Europeans are astonished. "If there be," wrote in 1879 Sir Rose Price, author of The Two Americas, "any race of people who exhibit more shrewdness than others in their ability to grasp and manipulate the apparently indistinct elements of what may lead to a commercial success, or be of ultimate benefit to their nation, those people are the Americans. No government throws away less money in useless expenditures, and no representative assembly more narrowly criticizes waste, yet the Americans subsidize considerable sums of their national revenue for the purpose of restocking the rivers of the eastern states by artificial culture, and with praiseworthy consideration, their government supports several ably conducted establishments from which fish ova are distributed, gratis, to all those who choose to apply. The very railroads assist this enterprise, and some by moderating their tariff, and others by generously conveying the ova free of charge, give every possible encouragement to what their common sense tells them must lead to so much national good. To expect an English government to exhibit the same amount of foresight, or to practice a similar generosity, would be to credit them with virtues which have yet to be developed. The American example, however, should not be lost sight of. The extent of the operations of the Fish Commission can only be barely indicated here. One fact alone shows the gigantic nature of its operations. It has planted German carp in 30,000 separate bodies of water, distributed through all the states and territories in the Union. The American Navy adds to its numerous non-combatant functions the principal astronomical work done in the United States. It daily gives to every important city the correct time and furnishes some data for the government publication, the Nautical Almanac. The Naval Observatory has acquired a just celebrity by its discovery of the satellites of Mars. The Patent Office and Museum is another important division of the government at Washington. Here are many thousand models of inventions of every possible kind. The list contains over 400 different patents of a nut lock. The policy of the Republic is to make the patent law the encouragement of inventors and not the means of revenue, with such good results that more than 300,000 patents have been issued since 1836. Last year, the total patents issued exceeded 24,000, nearly 80% more than in 1880. 40 years ago, the average number of patents issued annually did not exceed 500 or 600. If one wishes to realize the extent and versatility of the American inventor, it is needful to visit the enormous museum at the Patent Office. Miles of shelves and cases are filled with models, while acres of drawings and designs adorn the walls or lie hidden away in drawers. English visitors are usually greatly impressed with what they see there. Herbert Spencer could not withhold his admiration. He says, "The enormous museum of patents which I saw in Washington is significant of the attention paid to inventors' claims, and the nation profits immensely from having, in this direction, though not in others, recognized property in mental products. Beyond question, in respect of mechanical appliances, the Americans are ahead of all nations." One of the most important factors in the diffusion of knowledge among men is found in the system of international exchange carried on by the Smithsonian Institution. Originally intended for the distribution of its own publications, the institution, by degrees, extended its privileges to learned societies of both hemispheres, and, at present, it forms a medium of scientific intercourse between about 700 home institutions and 4,000 establishments distributed over all parts of the inhabited globe. The publications of any learned society in the world, whether in Japan, Norway, or California, if sent to Washington, will be distributed throughout the world without cost to the sender. In 1885, about 80,000 packages of books were thus sent from the Smithsonian Institution, containing in some cases its own publications, in others United States Blue Books, or the transactions of various learned societies in America and elsewhere. Many railway and steamship lines carry these packages gratuitously. In this work, the Smithsonian Institution stands alone. It is probably the most effective means of diffusing knowledge ever attempted, for it circulates to the ends of the world the knowledge which, put into volumes of transactions and blue books, has hitherto been relegated to the shelves of public libraries. The official publications of the results of these bureaus are so numerous that the United States government is the largest printer and publisher in the world. In the Book of Estimates for the next fiscal year, just sent to Congress, $1,380,000, £276,000, is asked for wages alone. There are on the payroll 400 compositors. 50 proofreaders are constantly employed, besides 115 press feeders and 34 ruling machine feeders. The estimates call for 100,000 reams of printing paper, or 48 million sheets, equal to 768 million pages. Of the annual report of the Commissioner of Agriculture, 300,000 copies are distributed. The reports of the Geological Survey, the Bureau of Ethnology, the reports of the Commission of Fish and Fisheries, the bulletins of the National Museum, and hundreds of other documents and reports are sent free and postage paid almost to everybody or anybody. For the preparation of this chapter, more than 70 separate government publications were obtained, the whole forming a perfect encyclopedia of governmental methods and results, of progress in art, science, and material resources. And this little library did not cost its collector a cent. Indeed, in some instances, the books were sent free from Washington to New York. Such liberality is unparalleled. The Republic is certainly no niggard. Much other extra-governmental work is done either by the government or, as in the case of the Smithsonian Institution, under its direction. But further details are not called for here. However opinions may differ as to the propriety of a government engaging in every kind of non-governmental work, there can be no difference of opinion as to the excellent methods and important results of these bureaus in Washington. Most of them are models of equipment and method. Of the hundreds of thousands of packages sent out by Mr. Boehmer of the Smithsonian Institution, not one has been lost. These offices are outside the influence of politics and run on from year to year as freely and frictionless as if political parties were as distant as the satellites of Mars, or as deep down in the sea as the protoplasmal jellyfish, about which these men of scientific light and leading write and print monologues at the public expense. Another fact elicited is that American progress is not limited to increasing crops or growing herds. In the higher domain of mind, in the alleviation of suffering, in the saving of life, in the facilitation of commerce, in the exploration of the world and the universe, in everything which tends to give life breadth as well as length, to make it more complete and more worth living, the Republic has contributed a very large quota. This high estimate of the value of the government bureaus has often been concurred in by foreigners. More than one celebrated Englishman has lamented to me that his country should be so far behind in similar work. It is the cue of the ruling classes of Europe to misrepresent the government of the democracy. They would have the people believe that it is weak, corrupt, and inefficient. But those who examine the subject carefully know it to be surprisingly strong, pure, efficient, and marvelously able. In none of the departments named in this chapter have politics the slightest influence. No politician could be found willing to apply any test but the suitability of the man for the work to be performed. These departments are generally under the control of permanent Army and Navy officers, who, I think my readers will not fail to note, are put by the Republic to much higher uses than the performance of their professional duties. If we leave the general work performed under governmental control and consider what the people do for themselves, we are even more strongly impressed than ever by their extraordinary power of administration. Take the city electrical service as an illustration. Police officers, fire engine houses, hotels, cab stands, railway stations, banks, offices, and private houses are in direct electrical communication, and telephonic communication is rapidly becoming no less general. The American Fire Department, again, is admittedly the best known. The horses are trained to rush out of their stalls into the shafts at the sound of the alarm. A single motion causes the harness to fall upon their backs. The men slide down posts from their bedrooms to the stable floor to economize time. The ambulance corps is unknown beyond the Republic. Its headquarters are at the principal hospitals. electric communication apprises the attendant of an accident, as in the case of the fire engine. The ambulance, with its soft bed in charge of 2 surgeons, is instantly dashing through the streets, sounding its bell, which notifies every vehicle to turn out of its path. In a short time, the injured is lying upon a bed under charge of competent surgeons, and is conveyed as rapidly as possible to the hospital. London physicians who see this American plan never fail to lament that even London has not yet attempted to produce any organization of like humane character. This remarkable talent for organization which the American people possess probably was never more clearly displayed than in the sanitary and Christian commissions instituted by private citizens during the Civil War. The military rations of the government, compared to those of any other government, are, to say the least, exceedingly liberal, all well enough for professional soldiers, but for the patriotic volunteer who went forth from his home to defend the Union as a duty, that was quite another matter. Nothing was too good for him. The people demanded that as far as possible every luxury should be his, and to provide this, committees were appointed in the cities and contributions solicited. The movement resulted in the 2 general organizations named above, which distributed more than $25 million, £5 million, worth of extra supplies among the soldiers during the struggle. The collection, transportation, and distribution of these supplies, which embraced everything from easy chairs for the wounded to delicacies for the sick, were admirably performed. Bret Harte gives a poetic description of the enthusiastic reception accorded by the troops to the wagons of the commission as they pushed to the front filled with the tender offerings of a grateful people. How are you, sanitary? Down the picket-guarded lane rolled the comfort-laden wain, cheered by shouts that shook the plain, soldier-like and merry. Phrases such as camps may teach, saber cuts of Saxon speech, such as bully, them's the peach, wade in, sanitary. Right and left the caissons drew as the car went lumbering through, quick succeeding in review, squadrons military. Sunburnt men with beards like frieze, smooth-faced boys, and cries like these, U.S. Sancom, that's the cheese. Pass in, sanitary. In such cheer it struggled on till the battle front was won. Then the car, its journey done, lo, was stationary. And where bullets whistling fly came the sadder, fainter cry. Help us, brothers, ere we die. Save us, sanitary. Such the work, the phantom flies, wrapped in battle clouds that rise. But the brave, whose dying eyes, veiled and visionary, see the jasper gates swung wide, see the parted throng outside, hears the voice to those who ride, pass in, sanitary. But while these supplies were pushed forward to the front, the attentions bestowed upon regiments passing to and from different fields of action were not less characteristic. I was then superintendent of the Pennsylvania Railway at Pittsburgh, through which perhaps more troops passed than through any other city. Society there determined that every regiment should be fed. Banqueted would be nearer the correct word. No hungry volunteer should ever pass through that city without being made to feel that a grateful people wished to do him honor. This being resolved upon, the young ladies, the daughters of the rich men, the millionaires, resolved that by no menial's hands should the defenders of their country be fed. They would organize and divide the duty among themselves, and with their own hands serve the men. The city hall was placed at their disposal, tables and cooking arrangements provided, and the work began. Every night, the list of ladies and gentlemen subject to call during that night was posted in the hall. It mattered not at what hour a regiment or detachment of troops was to arrive. A telegram from my office apprised the city hall. The men on duty went the rounds, 1, 2, 3, or 4 o'clock in the morning, as the case might be, and one after another of the ladies were called and escorted through the darkness to the hall. One of the sights of my life, I can scarcely recall the scene without my eyes filling with tears even today, was to see a regiment of bronzed men, such splendid fellows, as unlike professional cutthroats as black is unlike white, to see them marched into the hall, seated at tables loaded with the finest food, and then to witness their amazement as it dawned upon them, which of course it soon did, that the young women serving were not paid servants, but the darlings of society who had risen in the night and come forth to do them this honor. The meal ended, the colonel rose and asked for 3 cheers for the Pittsburgh Committee. Imagine how the boys in blue responded. But when, as was usually the case, there seemed something still lacking, some irrepressible longing which must find vent, and someone from the ranks called out, 3 cheers and a tiger for the young ladies of Pittsburgh. I hear their yell yet. I have seen enthusiastic crowds and heard ringing cheers, but of all the outbursts I ever heard, that of the bronzed veterans in honor of the young ladies of Pittsburgh takes the palm. And mark you, men so treated went to the front determined to fight as they cheered. How could they fail when the women of the land of their love came forth and said, night or day, we are proud to be your servants? 664,000 troops were fed in Pittsburgh in the manner I have described. The funds were always forthcoming, and at one fair held in the city for the Sanitary Committee, $300,000 were netted, 60,000 pounds. The age of miracles may have passed. Matthew Arnold is authority for the statement that the case is closed against them. But to all those who extol the past and dwell upon its heroes and heroines, intimating that our own age is less heroic than some age which has preceded it, let us make answer that for one true hero who existed in any age, 100 surround us today. And as for heroines, the world has scarcely ever known what one was until the present age. Women didn't know enough, as a rule, to be heroic until America educated her properly. There are 1,000 heroines in the world today, for every one any preceding age has produced. I thought 20-odd years ago, and I am still of opinion, that there were more heroic young ladies in Pittsburgh alone than the whole world could have produced not so very long ago, and Pittsburgh was but one of many cities equally stirred to its depths. I have seen the American people, young, middle-aged, and old, men and women, Democrat and Republican, touched upon the vital chord, and have heard and felt the response. Let no monarchical enemy of Americans, and all monarchists are her enemies, ever again flatter himself that the unity of the Republic does not command at all times the lives, the fortunes, and the sacred honor of the American people. When the Americans determined to hold a centennial exhibition, they went to work at it in the same business fashion. Not a governmental official was called upon. They organized in Philadelphia, and the result was that not only was the display the best ever made in any country, according to the judgment of the foreign visitors, but the exhibition was visited by more people than ever before visited an exhibition. The facilities for transportation were such that the millions were moved on time and without accident, and, more marvelous than all else, the centennial was so managed that it paid all expenses. An advance made by the government was repaid in full. The government had nothing to do with the management. It was exclusively an affair of the people and conducted throughout by them. This universal self-dependence is manifest everywhere and in everything. I stood with Archibald Forbes on the State Department steamer at Yorktown, Virginia, when the centennial anniversary of the surrender of Cornwallis was celebrated. We saw the disembarkation of some 30,000 militia troops and a grand review. Mr. Forbes remarked, "What surprises me more than anything I have seen today is the absence of a body of officials to take charge of the masses and assign them to places, etc. Every American seems to understand just where he is to go, what he is to do, and how best to do it. And then he quietly goes and does it, and all comes out successfully. There is nothing like this in Europe." Such is the universal testimony of competent foreign observers. The cause of this self-governing capacity lies in the fact that from his earliest youth, the Republican feels himself a man. He is called upon to participate in the management of the local affairs of his township, county, or city, or in his relations with his fellows, in his church, trades union, cooperative store, or reading room, or even in his musical or dramatic society, baseball, cricket, or boating club. Everywhere he is ushered into a democratic system of government in which he stands upon an equal footing with his fellows, and in which he feels himself bound to exercise the rights of a citizen. Those with talent for management naturally rise to command in their small circles, and upon great public occasions, when thousands of such circles are massed, the orderly habits prevailing in each circle render possible the easy and proper management of the vast crowd. We can confidently claim for the democracy that it produces a people self-reliant beyond all others, a people who depend less upon governmental aid and more upon themselves in all the complex relations of society than any people hitherto known. At the same time, their individual talent for organization and administration has been so concentrated as to produce through official channels various departments of universal benefit to the Commonwealth, none of which have ever been equaled, and some of which have never even been attempted under monarchical government. We look in vain throughout the world for such beneficent organizations connected with the government of any country as those described in this chapter. So far, therefore, from the government of the people falling behind the government of a class in the art of government, we are amazed at the contrast presented between the old form and the new in favor of the new. The truth is that the monarchical form lacks the vigor and elasticity necessary to cope with the republican in any department of government whatever. End of Chapter 18, The Government's Non-Political Work.
Chapter 19, Part 1 of Triumphant Democracy by Andrew Carnegie. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Maria James. Triumphant Democracy by Andrew Carnegie, Chapter 19, Part 1. The National Balance Sheet. The chapter begins with a quote. A national debt is vicious in principle, deceitful in its effects upon the state which borrows, hurtful to posterity which must pay, and tending to lead rulers into useless wars and extravagant expenditure of public money. Close quote. Thomas Spencer. National debts grow troublesome. Year after year, the burden they lay upon the productive energies of nations becomes harder and harder to bear. The 12 years between 1870 and 1882 have eclipsed all others in the amounts added to the already sorely burdened masses of Europe. Russia has saddled herself with $1,365,000,000, £273 million more debt in these short 12 years, an average increase of nearly $115 million, £23 million per annum, a load fit to weigh an empire down. France's obligations have swollen to $2,215,000,000, £443 million, and even Spain must be in the fashion and add $525 million, £105 million. And Italy, not to be behind in this mad race, has contracted $740 million, £148 million more. And even poor, decaying Turkey has found credulous capitalists to lend her $90 million, £18 million, during this period. The aggregate of these obligations in Europe has increased since 1848 from $14,940,000,000, £2,988,000,000, to $20,935,000,000, £4,187,000,000, and most of this increase has been consumed in wars, which have left matters much as they were or would have been if never waged. Such is the inevitable result of anti-democratic rule. Britain alone, let us record it to her credit, is the only power which has resolutely reduced her debt. It is less by $465 million, £93 million, in 1884 than it was in 1857, while her wealth has enormously increased. It is easy to meet deficits by the proceeds of new loans, but it were well that nations should be of opinion with the Chinese laundryman of New York, who refused to give a note bearing interest. Quote, "No noti," said our heathen Chinese. Noti, walkie, ollie, tiny, walkie, no, sleepy. Close quote. Nations forget this peculiarity of new issues. Sleeping or waking, the load of interest swells noiselessly on Saturdays and Sundays alike. The Republic emulates her mother's example and cuts down her debt with unexampled rapidity. It is a curious fact that these, the two English-speaking nations, should be the only ones who resolutely set their faces strongly in the debt-discharging direction. The other races appear content to borrow as long as they can and let the future take care of itself. We are not without ominous signs that in some instances the strain upon their resources cannot be increased further without danger. Perhaps the democracy is soon to awaken to the truth that these vast accumulations of debt have their real source in the rule of monarchs and courts, whose jealousies and dynastic ambitions, stimulated by the great military classes always created by them, produce the wars or continual preparation for wars, which eat up the people's substance and add to their burdens year after year. A nation with a large standing army and navy is bound to make wars. One great advantage which the democracy has secured for itself in America is its comparative freedom from debt. The ratio of indebtedness to wealth is strikingly small. Including all debt, municipal, state, and national, it is but 4 1/20%, the national debt alone being less than 3.5%, as compared with 8 3/4% in Britain, 11 1/3% in France, 22 1/4% in Italy, 24.5% in Spain, and 25.5% in Portugal. This was in 1880. Since then, the reduction of the national debt and the increase of wealth have been so great that it is close upon 2%, not 1/4 of that of Britain, nor 1/5 of that of France. Contrary to the general impression, the debts of the various states which comprise the Union are trifling, being but 0.6% upon the valuation. Several states have no debt, others have revenues from public lands sufficient to pay the entire expenses of the state government. The municipal debts of the cities of America are likewise very small compared to those of Britain, being only 1 2/10% upon the valuation of city property. Taking all the state and city debts of the Union and rating them according to valuation of property, both combined do not amount to 1/5 of the city debt of Manchester, nor to 1/10 of the debt of Birmingham, while Liverpool owes in proportion to its wealth £50, $250, for every pound, $5, owed by the cities of America taken as a whole. If we add to the municipal debts of America the state and also the national debt, Liverpool's municipal debt alone is still 7 times greater than all of these combined. Even the city of Manchester, which does not rate high as a debtor, owes in its corporate capacity alone in proportion to its wealth 2.5 times as much as the ratio of indebtedness of all American cities, all state debts, and all debts of the national government. The cities of Great Britain owe $765 million, £153 million. Those of America, notwithstanding their greater number, population, and wealth, only $575 million, £115 million. If to the American municipal debt we add the debt of all the states, we have only $865 million, £173 million, for city and state debt as against $765 million, £153 million, in Britain for city debt alone. The following are given by Mulhall. Debt to valuation: Liverpool 32.5, Manchester 10, Birmingham 21.8, Leeds 15.8. London, which is in debt only 3%, finds a worthy compeer in Philadelphia whose debt is even a fraction less. New York stands with Manchester at 10 4/10. America has no city so deeply involved as Liverpool, Birmingham, or Leeds. But in the case of Liverpool, I am reminded of Artemus Ward, who met in London a gentleman from that city, who told them there were some docks or something which he should have seen. And in regard to Birmingham, no one who has been privileged to examine the work which that model of municipal life is doing will think the debt unwisely incurred. It is evident, however, that with all the push of the American, he is distanced by his illustrious ancestor in the race for debt in his corporate capacity. The Republican has so managed that the annual charge for all debt against him per head is not 1/4 of that which his brother in Britain has incurred. Every Briton owes of national debt $110, £22. Every Frenchman $120, £24. Every Italian $90, £18, while the American owes but $30, £6. Every Canadian owes of public debt alone in proportion to wealth $6.15, £1, 4 shillings, 6 pence. Every Australian $16.15, £3, 4 shillings, 6 pence. While, as we have before seen, the American, with all his resources and rosy expectation, has burdened himself with only $3.49, 14 shillings, and is rapidly paying that off. This is but one more added to the proofs that lie open at all points to anyone who will take the trouble to examine and compare the facts that the masses made equal politically under the sway of democracy are not prone to wild excesses. They have developed in the United States into one of the most conservative communities in the world, conservative of their powerful government, of their Supreme Court, and of their Senate, and of all that makes for the security of civil and religious liberty, of the rights of property, and the constitutional right of each individual to the pursuit of happiness in his own way, subject only to the limitations that he interfere not with the enjoyment of the same right by others. Let the student of American institutions direct his attention to this fact, and see whether the Republic be not a very conservative Republic indeed. Nowhere is so well understood the difference between liberty and license. In 1835, just half a century ago, the Republic was not only free from debt, but had a surplus in the Treasury. How to dispose of this surplus was a matter of grave concern. No wonder, for assuredly there existed no precedent in the history of the world, and statesmen are the slaves of precedent, to throw light upon the novel question, not how a nation can wipe out its debt, that would be hard enough, but how a nation is to get rid of its surplus. Even as late as 1857, only 28 years ago, the debt was but $29 million, not £6 million. Today, the interest-bearing debt is about $1.5 billion, £300 million. My readers may be ready to suggest that in no department has the Republic made greater progress than in running into debt. Only 28 years ago, in debt, $30 million, and today 50 times that sum. It is quite as extraordinary as an increase as is seen in her growth of wheat. Even the growth of the Bessemer steel industry does not much exceed it. And as we have had to award her the prize for rapid development in numerous branches over the motherland, let us hasten to credit the latter with setting an example to her precocious child. For the debt of Britain during the past 30 years has not only not increased, but has been reduced $310 million, £62 million. The explanation of the increased debt of the Republic is, of course, found in the civil conflict between slavery and freedom. The two systems were antagonistic, and the irrepressible issue had to be met sooner or later. Either the equality of the citizen was or was not the foundation of the state. There was no middle ground. It has been decided, but the cost was frightful. That part of it, unpaid at the close of the struggle, which could be represented by dollars, and that much the smaller part, amounted to $2,770,000,000, £554 million. Unadjusted claims subsequently paid made the total debt more than $3 billion, £600 million. Thus stood the account in 1866, 20 years ago. The annual interest charge was no less than $146 million, nearly £30 million, being 2 millions sterling more than that of Britain. Many were the predictions throughout Europe that the masses who held full and unlimited sway would never take such a load upon their shoulders and patiently endure the taxation necessary to carry it, much less pay it off. Much of the debt had been contracted at excessive rates of interest, 6%, and at periods when less than 50% in gold was obtained for the bonds issued. Universal suffrage could never be brought to pay back in gold the par value of such issues. It would require a government of the educated and enlightened few, a monarchy, for instance, to keep its financial honor untarnished. In Britain, such ideas prevailed, especially among financiers. Mr. Gladstone gives them expression in Kin Beyond the Sea. Quote, "In 12 years she, America, has reduced her debt by £158 million, or at the rate of £13 million for each year. In each 12 months she has done what we did in 8 years. Her self-command, self-denial, and wise forethought for the future have been, to say the least, eightfold ours. These are facts which redounded greatly to her honor, and the historian will record with surprise that an enfranchised nation tolerated burdens which in this country a selected class, possessed of the representation, did not dare to face, and that the most unmitigated democracy known to the annals of the world resolutely reduced at its own cost prospective liabilities of the state which the aristocratic and plutocratic and monarchical government of the United Kingdom had been contented ignobly to hand over to posterity. The financiers of the continent, and especially of Germany, knew the character of democracy better, and profited accordingly. Many fortunes were made by investments in American bonds, which rapidly doubled in value. The most notable case in my own experience was that of an uncle in Scotland who had always, like John Bright, believed in the Republic, and had implicit faith in the American people in general, and perhaps his nephew in particular. At the darkest hour of the conflict, when gold was worth nearly 3 times the value of currency, this staunch friend of the Republic remitted me a considerable sum of money, saying, "Invest this for me as you think best, but if you put it in United States bonds it will add to my pleasure, for then I can feel that in her hour of danger I have never lost faith in the Republic." Close quote. 3 times the value of his gold when remitted, and double the value of his patriotic investment since, has rewarded his faith in the triumph of democracy. Starting then 20 years ago, 1866, with $3 billion, £600 million, as the national burden, with an annual interest charge of nearly $146 million, £29.2 million. What has the democracy done up to the 1st of January, 1885? It has paid more than half of the huge sum and reduced it to less than $1.5 billion, or £300 million. Here is the last monthly statement. Debt less cash in Treasury, January 1st, 1886, $1,443,454,826. Debt less cash in Treasury, December 1st, 1885, $1,452,544,766. Decrease of debt during the month, $9,089,940. The interest charge has fallen from $146 million, £29.2 million, to $51 million, £10.2 million. In 2 successive years of this period, the reduction amounted to $270 million, £54 million, but this rate being considered too rapid, taxes were repealed and large sums voted for increased pensions to the sailors and soldiers who crushed the rebellion. The American has to continue for only 12 years more to reduce the national debt as he has for the past 20 years in order to wipe it out entirely. It may confidently be predicted that ere the close of this century, extraordinary events excepted, the last bond of the Republic will be publicly burned at Washington with imposing ceremonies, amidst the universal rejoicings of the people. The democracy seems destined to set an example in many ways to the monarchies of the world, not the least important being that of a people resolutely pursuing the policy of reducing its debt until the last dollar is paid, that its resources may remain unimpaired to meet the emergencies which may arise to affect its position among the nations. Where is the monarchy which can vie with this democracy in conservative finance or thoughtful care for its country's future? Mr. Gladstone says the parent land ignobly hands her debt over to posterity. From a position so discredited that 6% bonds did not net more than half their par value in gold, The government of the people has risen in the estimation of the capitalists of the world to so high a point that its bonds bearing only 3% command a premium. What the world thinks of democracy is this: that beyond the credit of any nation, even higher than that of Great Britain, stands the obligations of a government founded upon the equality of the citizen. A leading Liberal cabinet minister, not Mr. Gladstone, not Mr. Chamberlain, for they know America not much but a little better, once asked me whether, in a contingency which then threatened to arise in the Republic, namely, a contested presidential election, and which did indeed arise and passed away harmlessly, there would not be a revolution which would involve the stability of our institutions. My reply was, "Have you noticed today's quotations of American 3%? "No," he said. "What are they?" "Higher than yours," I said, and looked straight at him. That was all, but it was sufficient. Whenever a man, even a Liberal cabinet minister, begins to doubt the stability of a government of the people, for the people, and by the people, and there are Liberal cabinet ministers whose faith in the democracy is as a grain of mustard seed, ask him why the credit of this new democracy stands before that of the old monarchy. Why would the world lend this democracy more money and upon better terms than it would lend the best government of the few? Why does the world pay for American 3% more than it will pay for the British 3%? The answer is obvious. Because the reign of the whole of the people of a state is more secure than the reign of any class in a state can possibly be. A class may be upset, nay, is sure to be sooner or later. The people are forever and ever in power. The revenues of the government. It was often said, up to the breaking out of the slaveholders' rebellion in 1861, that the American did not know that he had a national government. Certainly, as far as taxation was concerned, he had little to remind him of the fact. In 1830, the total revenues collected were not quite $2 per head, 8 shillings. In 1840, they had fallen below $1.25, 5 shillings. And even as late as 1860, 25 years ago, the American enjoyed all the blessings of government at a cost of $1.75, 7 shillings, per annum. This was collected principally from customs and sales of public lands. There was no such thing known as an excise or internal tax, so that the citizen never was visited by a revenue officer of any kind. The American was born, lived, and died, and was never asked to contribute a cent to his government. Unless he lived at a seaport and visited the custom house, he probably never saw a man whose duty it was to collect a national tax. In this blessed year of 1860, the total national revenue was only $56 million, 11.2 million pounds. In 1866, it reached its maximum, or $558 million, 111.6 million pounds. After 1860, war taxes were necessary, and the Republican became aware of the fact, well known everywhere else, that it costs money to wage war. Internal and excise taxes were resorted to, and the citizen made the acquaintance of the revenue officer in full force. For the first time, his revenues were made subject to an income tax, fairest of all taxes in theory, most odious of all in practice. It was, however, a graduated income tax which exempted the masses, but exacted 5% upon the largest incomes. During the 6 years from 1861 to 1867, enormous sums, from $400 to $500 million, 80 million pounds to 100 million pounds, were raised by taxes by the general government. The Republican might have fancied himself enjoying for a time the blessings of the British monarchy, for the taxation was about equal, each nation drawing about $400 million, £80 million per annum from its people. With the collapse of the rebellion, the Republic began to set its finances in order. Taxes were rapidly reduced, and among the first to go was the income tax. Then followed the reduction or repeal of one internal tax after another, till finally today, with the exception of the taxes on whiskey and tobacco, producing in the aggregate $145 million, £29 million. But few, of a trifling character, remain. With these exceptions, the Republican knows nothing of internal taxation. His acquaintance with the revenue officer has almost ceased. Once more, he is free. He has neither income tax nor legacy duty. End of Chapter 19, Part 1. Chapter 19, Part 2 of Triumphant Democracy by Andrew Carnegie. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Maria James. Triumphant Democracy by Andrew Carnegie, Chapter 19, Part 2. We beg the careful attention of thoughtful, moderate men to the fact that although the income tax was paid wholly by the few, yet the masses upon whom it had no direct bearing urged its repeal, because it was proved in practice that the honest were assessed while the dishonest escaped. Thus, we get one more proof that the masses can always be trusted to act fairly and to correct injustice. Since 1866, 20 years ago, when the national revenues from taxation amounted to a sum equal to $17, £3 8 shillings, drawn from each man, woman, and child in the country, they had fallen in 1880 to less than $7, 28 shillings. And of this, more than $1, 4 shillings, per head went to reduce the debt. The taxes are collected in America much as in Britain, about equally from foreign imports and from home products, although the recent rapid repeals and reduction of internal taxes in America have somewhat disturbed this division. In 1880, for instance, the foreign products contributed more than the domestic, foreign giving $190 million, £38 million, and the domestic $125 million, £25 million. If it were not for the seemingly immovable determination of the people not to permit the manufacture of whiskey and tobacco to escape special taxation as articles, the free use of which should be discouraged, this difference between the production of taxation upon home and foreign products would soon be much greater. For to sweep away the entire Department of Internal Revenue and thus reduce the number of government officials and free the citizen entirely from their supervision is a temptation hard to resist by the American people. The cost of government. We have seen that in 1880 the general government was in receipt of about $335 million, say £67 million, but notwithstanding great reductions made in taxes, both tariff and internal, the receipts of 1882 and 1883 reached $400 million, £80 million. As the official figures for these years are obtainable, we shall use them instead of those for 1880. How, then, does the Republic get rid of her 80 millions sterling per annum, a revenue about equal to that collected by the British government? Here is the record for 1883. First, of course, for interest upon the national debt, this required $50 million, £10 million. And what, think you, is the greatest charge upon the state? For what does the Republic spend most money? Republics are proverbially ungrateful, you know, so says the monarchist. Well, this republic certainly does not spend $5 millions per annum upon a single family and its appurtenances, nor lavish fortunes at one vote upon its high officials or members of an aristocracy. Still, it spends more money in pensions to the soldiers and sailors who served it in its hour of need than upon any branch of the service, more than upon army and navy combined, more than the interest upon its debt, more than upon anything else. To reward these men, not one man or a few high officers alone, as is the case in Britain and elsewhere in Europe, but every man, private as well as commander, in settled proportions as to rank. The Republic spent in 1883 no less than $66 million, 13.2 million pounds. The democracy may be trusted to insist, when they have the power, that the poor private who fought shall not be neglected when the state dispenses its rewards. I heard Mr. Cohen, the Radical, nay, the Republican member for Newcastle, in a speech in the House of Commons favouring the grant to Wolseley and Seymour, hold up to scorn the American Republic for the shabby manner in which it treated its servants. The difference here is just the difference between a monarchy and a republic, between the rule of the people and the rule of a class. In the monarchy, the officers are unduly rewarded by their class, who are in power, whether called liberal or conservative, still their class, while the private, who has few or none of his class as legislators, is neglected. In a republic, the first care is for the masses in army or navy, the privates and their widows and orphans. The officers come after, though both share liberally. So in all legislation, the good of the millions first, the luxuries of the few afterward. This statement is worth emphasizing. The Republic gives more each year as rewards to the brave men and their widows and orphans who defended the integrity of the nation when assailed than she thinks it worth while to expend in maintaining all her military or naval forces. If republics are, as a rule, ungrateful, at least we find a notable exception to the rule in the case of the greatest republic of all. The truth is that republics are only prudent in giving to the rich few and prodigal to a fault in lavishing upon the poorer masses. This is a failing which leans to virtue's side. Time after time, since the close of the war, the pension roll has been enlarged and the payments increased. It seems as if the people could not lavish enough upon, or sufficiently testify their gratitude to, their soldiers and sailors who have been injured or have become disabled in their service. Even as I am correcting the proofs of this chapter, the House of Representatives has passed by a vote of 4-1 an act to increase the pensions to soldiers and sailors' widows 25%. From $8, £1 12 shillings, to $10, £2. To the charge that republics are ungrateful, the reply is that the one republic gives more beyond their regular pay to its citizens who have served in army or navy than all the other governments of the world combined. Next in cost comes the War Department, which, although of ridiculously small dimensions compared with that of other civilized nations, I regret to chronicle, cost in 1883 no less than $49 million, 9.8 million pounds, which was exceptionally great. The cost averages about $40 million, 8 million pounds. The Navy Department absorbed $15 million, 3 million pounds. As the Army consists of but 25,000 men, we cannot look for any reduction there till the vast unoccupied territories are peopled. A strong armed police force is required to keep the Indians in order, and the almost equally troublesome aggregate of restless spirits from all lands who naturally gravitate to the semi-civilized life which precedes the reign of law and order. In the States, as distinguished from the territories, the American rarely sees a man in uniform whose profession is the scientific killing of other men. The war expenditure, one is delighted to record, embraces the improvements of harbor and rivers, and upon this highly useful work many of the officers are constantly engaged. The Engineer Corps has rendered exceptionally valuable services in this department. An annual appropriation is made for improving rivers and harbors, $6 million to $10 million, 1.2 to 2 million pounds, and charged to the War Department, which sum should fairly be deducted from war expenditures, for this is not for destructive purposes, but emphatically in the interests of peace. The American people annually spend upon the 300,000 Indians scattered over the land about $6 million, equal to $20, £4 per Indian. They are as kindly treated as practicable. a commission of well-known philanthropic men of national reputation is appointed by the President to supervise all matter relating to these poor unfortunate tribes. The success of the Indian policy may best be judged by the fact that out of the total number of 310,000, no less than 66,000 are reported civilized. The proof of civilization being that they pay taxes, and of all the proofs possible to adduce, we submit this is the most conclusive as to their civilization. The political economist, at least, will seek no further, but rest satisfied. It is indeed surprising that 1/5 of all the Indians have abandoned their nomadic habits and embraced civilization. It is clear that the real, live, war-whooping Indian is being rapidly civilized off the face of the earth. We shall soon search as hopelessly over the prairies for the noble red men as we should do over Scotch moors and glens for the Rob Roy of Scott. Under the head of miscellaneous come 1,001 items of expenditure which embrace everything not under heads before given. The total is about $68 million. About 13.6 million pounds in 1883. The principal items are for the agricultural, meteorological, and educational departments and the various bureaus which, by their varied and useful functions, cause such astonishment and admiration in foreign visitors to Washington. As the Republic pays every official who renders service, it may be interesting to compare the cost of this plan with that of the monarchy, which depends upon the gratuitous services of its legislators. Here is the account. The Republic. The President, $50,000, 10,000 pounds. The Vice President, $9,000, 1,800 pounds. 74 senators, $5,000 or 1,000 pounds each. Total, $370,000, 74,000 pounds. 325 representatives, $5,000 or 1,000 pounds each. Total, $1,625,000, 325,000 pounds. Total, $2,054,000, 410,800 pounds. The Monarchy. The Queen, $3.1 million. 619,379 pounds. Prince and Princess of Wales, $600,000, 120,000 pounds. Other members of the royal family, $600,000, 121,000 pounds. Total, $4,300,000, 860,379 pounds. Members of the cabinet are paid about the same in both countries. I have known well-informed Britons who believed that the cost of government in America was greater than their own. The figures given prove that the amount paid by the Republic for the 400 officers and legislators who form her governing body does not amount to half as much as the monarchy squanders upon one family which has neither public duties nor official responsibility, and which sets an example of wasteful and showy living to the injury of the nation. One scarcely knows at which to wonder most, the fatuous folly of the people in permitting this great sum to go to one family, which is really one of the scandals of our age, or that any well-educated family possessed of even ordinary sensibility can be found to take from a people, many of whom are sorely pressed for the necessaries of life, this enormous amount of their earnings and waste it upon their own mean and coarse extravagance. No fact more clearly proves the corrupting tendency of privilege or caste upon those unfortunately born under it. They must grow callous and unmindful of all but themselves. It will puzzle my American readers to imagine how such enormous sums can possibly be spent upon one family. Perhaps one item will shed light upon it. Sir Charles Dilke has charged that public funds are squandered to the amount of £100,000, $500,000, per annum upon yachts for Her Majesty's use, while, mark you, she has not been half a dozen times a year in a yacht during her entire reign. The sum spent by this model queen for useless pleasure boats alone is greater than the American pays his president and vice president, the cabinet officers, and all the judges of the Supreme Court combined. One marvels, when such abuses are revealed, that any member of the royal family is safe in open day. We should expect that public indignation would at least concentrate in one universal hiss. How long would Americans tolerate an abuse like this, think you? Turn the rascals out would again be the cry, and the delinquents would know better than to stay to be driven. The next Cunarder would have them booked, under assumed names, bound for happier climes. But the story does not stop here. This family finds in every marriage of their children a fresh plea for demanding money, and at every death they saddle the nation with the funeral expenses. The royal mother of her people cannot be induced to support her own children during life, or even to bury them decently at death, as long as the public can be further bled. All this is no reflection upon the royal family of England, for all other royal families do the same. They are as good a royal family as anywhere to be found. Certainly the Queen is personally one of the best women who ever occupied a throne. It is the fault of the system that such callousness is bred in those who would otherwise be good people. The system, not its victims, is to blame. The royal family is only one of many evils with which monarchical institutions infest a state. The Financial Reform Almanac states that within the last 33 years, the dukes, earls, and marquises, with their relatives, the inevitable brood of royalty, have taken from the exchequer more than £66 million, $330 million, an average levy of 2 millions sterling, being as great as the entire sum spent by the government for the education of the people. John Bright told the people that the government was only a system of outdoor relief for the aristocracy, and he was right as usual. It is well for the American people to get a glimpse now and then of the blots of other lands, that they may duly appreciate their own comparative purity. Whenever an American is met abroad with the assertion that the government in the Republic is corrupt, he can safely say that for 1 ounce of corruption here, there is a full pound avoirdupois in Britain. For every job here, 20 yonder. Just look at some of the jobs. The Prince of Wales is colonel of this or that regiment, and draws salaries for duties he does not pretend to perform. He has many mean modes of drawing money from the public. He is made a field marshal. One brother gets a high command in India. The Duke of Edinburgh gets command of the Channel Fleet. The Duke of Cambridge, although commander-in-chief, does not scorn to draw a salary as Ranger of Richmond Park, and royal favourites by the score monopolize sinecure positions. One nobleman gets £4,000, $20,000, per year for walking backward before Her Majesty upon certain occasions, and so on through a chapter of jobs, so long and irritating that no American could patiently read through it. When the democracy gets firmly in the saddle, we shall see a change in all this. A purifying of the Aegean stables of monarchy. The corruption then exposed will surprise the Republican. I do not believe that there could be found today a family whose head is in public life and honored by the Republic which would accept and use, as the royal family accepts and uses, the inordinate sums granted to them. The tendency of republicanism is to promote simplicity and a higher standard than that of showy living. President Cleveland, in his inaugural message, expresses the feelings of the people when he says, quote, "We should never be ashamed of the simplicity and prudential economies which are best suited to the operation of a republican form of government and most compatible with the mission of the American people. Those who are selected for a limited time to manage public affairs are still of the people, and may do much by their example to encourage, consistently with the dignity of their official functions, that plain way of life which among their fellow citizens aids integrity and promotes thrift and prosperity." Close quote. The monarchy thinks show grand, the Republic votes it vulgar. To sum up all, the government of the people in 18 years has reduced its debt at the average rate of $55 million, £11 million per annum, and the interest charge of its debt in that period to 1/3 its cost. It has abolished and reduced taxes from time to time until there remains of internal taxation only the taxes upon whiskey and tobacco, stamps, etc. The income tax has gone with the others. Such a record the world has not seen before. The answer to doubters of the stability of the democracy, like Sir Henry Maine, is here. December 1885. Republican 3%, 103.5. Monarchical 3%, 99.5. Were the consuls of America perpetual like those of Britain, and not redeemable at a fixed date, their value would be still higher. The triumph of democracy is palpable in many departments. In education, in population, in wealth, in agriculture, and in manufactures. In annual savings, as we have seen, it stands first. But to the conservative mind, surely the last domain in which the democracy could be expected to excel even Great Britain is that of credit. It has been the boast, one of the many proud boasts of the dear parent land, that her institutions were stable as the rock, as proved by her consuls, which stood preeminent throughout the world. Now comes her republican child, and plucks from her queenly head the golden round of public credit as hers of right, and places it upon her own fair brow. It has been my privilege to claim many victories for triumphant democracy, but surely the world will join me in saying none is more surprising than this, that its public credit stands before that of Great Britain, and first in all the world. End of chapter 19.
Chapter 20, Part 1 of Triumphant Democracy by Andrew Carnegie. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in October 2020. Triumphant Democracy by Andrew Carnegie, Chapter 20, Part 1, General Reflections. This chapter starts with a quotation. The plain truth is that educated Englishmen are slowly learning that the American Republic affords the best example of a conservative democracy. And now that England is becoming democratic, respectable Englishmen are beginning to consider whether the Constitution of the United States may not afford means by which, under new democratic forms, may be preserved the political conservatism dear and habitual to the governing classes of England. End quote, by Dicey. Politics are not the incessant theme in the Republic which they are in the monarchy. This difference has its rise in two causes. First, no party in America desires a change in any of the fundamental laws. If asked what important law I should change, I must perforce say, none. The laws are perfect. These being settled as desired by all, it follows that a vital question can arise but seldom. The outs are left to insist that they could and would administer existing laws better or more purely than the ins. A politician may safely be challenged to state wherein the Democratic and Republican parties of today differ. If one of the outs, he will say that the ins, having had control too long, have become corrupt, and that as a new broom sweeps clean, a change is desirable. But ask him which, if any, of the national laws or forms he would change, and he is dumb. Second, the nation having by universal suffrage and equal districts committed to certain men the management of affairs for a short term, public sentiment says, let them have their innings, and let us see how they succeed. We shall soon judge them by their fruits. They cannot be put out till their terms expire, therefore there is no sense in our becoming excited over politics until the time comes for an election. The party in opposition cannot be stirred to action when it is impossible for it to obtain power. Therefore, the political excitement which always exists in Britain breaks out in the Republic only once every 4 years. One hears more political discussion at a dinner in London than during the whole season in New York or Washington. It is often charged that politics in the Republic are generally in the hands of men of position and character inferior to those of similar position in Britain. This is quite true. Until the final form of her political institutions is reached in Britain, the important work to be done will attract able men. When the Civil War in America revealed the need for able men, America's best came forward and met the need. A notable change took place in the men who went to Washington. In the usual routine of national life in America, the only political work to be done is such as young, briefless lawyers and unsuccessful men of affairs can easily perform. They have to follow public opinion and are mere agents. When great issues no longer divide the British people, the same result may be expected. Able men, not influenced by personal vanity and desirous of leading lives of the greatest possible usefulness, will be unable to persuade themselves that attention to the administration of laws already fixed is the highest field, and will leave it to those of inferior nature or of less experience and ability. The highest ability and purest character, though lost to politics, will not, however, be lost to the nation, but really constitute, in a fuller sense, more vital parts of it, and enrich it more than they do now, when the final settlement of laws, which is still to be made by the democracy, absorbs so much of their precious time. The difference between the House of Commons and its offshoot in Washington, which is productive of the most far-reaching effects, but which has hitherto received but little public attention in Britain, is the payment of its members. This difference is fundamental. Pay members, and the people are then properly represented. Parliament is then the people's house. Refuse to pay members, and Parliament is primarily the house of the rich, and but imperfectly represents the masses. It is because this is the case that both Liberal and Conservative are found deprecating the payment of members, for it is still true that triumphing Tories and despairing Whigs forget their feuds to save their wigs. There are too many members of Parliament, both Liberal and Conservative, who owe their places to the fact that they can live without work to render any change easy. No other reason can be assigned against their payment, because members of the Cabinet and other great officers of state are paid, as in America. Why should a Cabinet minister receive a compensation and a member none? It will hardly be contended that an ordinary member of Parliament would be disgraced or his tone lowered by accepting remuneration for his services, as do Mr. Gladstone and the Marquis of Salisbury. When the day arrives in which poor but eminently capable men can enter public life in Britain, there will be little left of aristocratic institutions. Until they can do so, even the House of Commons is the house of the rich, as the House of Lords is the house of the landlords. The people are represented by neither. In the Republic, as we have seen, every man serving the state is moderately compensated, but mark also this, no man is compelled to take it. Everyone is free to serve the state gratuitously if he so desire. The immense advantage resulting from the periodical election of officials is that they are less influenced by every passing wind of popular frenzy. They will more readily adopt a policy which their superior knowledge tells them will eventually produce good results, although at the moment excited popular opinion may be in opposition. They at least are firm and are able to steer steadily. They do not lose their official heads until their term of service ends. The ministers and members of Parliament in Great Britain are like so many agile performers on the tightrope. No one knows the moment they may fall, nor worst of all the cause which may throw them. The nation, kept in a state of unhealthy suspense from day to day, cannot unreservedly do its best work, because all eyes are turned to these performers. There is every morning the chance of a grand spill, and no one wants to miss it. The fatal defect of the British Constitution, since the power of the throne has gone, is a weak executive liable to be swept along by any gust of opinion. It cannot await the return of sober reason for the calm and settled conclusion of the people. It is the second and not the first will of the people which is the voice of God. As a consequence, the members of the government do not hesitate to plead that they are not to be held responsible for such and such acts, because public opinion demanded them, as if they had not been designated by the people expressly to withstand popular excitement and to do not what was popular but what was best, regardless of clamor. Such an excuse would be held in the Republic to disgrace a government. The influence of this condition of affairs upon the politicians of Britain is bad in every respect. They are tempted to sacrifice so much in order to retain place that instead of producing a body of men whose first and last thought is for principle, the tendency is to produce men who are pliable to a degree and ready to adopt any measures necessary to maintain their own party in power. We lately saw the Conservative Party passing liberal measures rather than resign office, and a short time ago we saw the Liberal Party adopting Tory policy in the Sudan simply because they were afraid that if they did not, they might lose office. The most adroit, and must we say it, least scrupulous party managers, and not the truest statesmen, are the likeliest to receive and to retain power. In these days when much is said against the dangers of democracy, de Tocqueville's wise saying should be remembered. Extreme democracy prevents the dangers of democracy. Not only is the Republic, with its fixed terms of office, its Supreme Court, and two chambers with real power, a much more conservative form of government than the monarchy, since the power passed from the aristocratic few into the masses, but the people themselves have become, under republican institutions, a much more conservative people in their political institutions than their progenitors, conservative in the sense that they desire no change. The national constitution illustrates this. Since its adoption in 1787, it has only been twice amended, and for many years there has not been one word added or erased, and the recent amendments made have resulted solely from new questions created by the overthrow of slavery. On no other point has a word been changed. On the other hand, the British Constitution has been so tampered with from time to time as to become almost unrecognizable as its former self. Well may Tennyson write, I honor him by omitting my lord, quote, As to any vital changes in our constitutions, I could wish that some of our prominent politicians who look to America as their ideal might borrow from her an equivalent to that conservatively restrictive provision under the 5th article of her Constitution. I believe that it would be a great safeguard to our own in these days of ignorant and reckless theorists. End quote. Theories of the power of the people obtain in Britain which are unthought of in America. Such an act as the recent Irish Land Bill, which took from the owners of property the right to let it in open market and enjoy the resulting revenues, would not find a party to advocate it, much less a House of Representatives to entertain it. And even if passed by both houses and approved by the President, the Supreme Court would be bound to make it void, for a change of the Constitution would be necessary to render such an act legitimate. Property, property, property has been the cry of the owning and governing classes of the monarchy. Yet the sacred rights of property are today much more securely guarded by the democracy of the Republic than they can possibly be in the monarchy. The capitalist and property owner is more secure in the enjoyment of his property in the new than in the old country. In land, for instance, he has most citizens sustaining him in his right, for the millions own the soil in small parcels. Property in land stands, and always has stood, upon the same footing as any other kind of property. Therefore, land proprietorship has not been rendered odious by unfair advantages conferred upon it. Its sale is free, and it is taxed upon its value as other property is. It can be taken at a valuation for railways or other public purposes. There is neither primogeniture nor entail. The free play of the law of dispersion has been found quite sufficient to prevent the troubles which afflict Britain in its management of the soil. When land is free and subject only to the general laws regarding property, its owners will rest in peaceful possession, but never till then. The cable informs us that in Mr. Gladstone's plan for Home Rule, special means are to be taken to prevent unjust laws being enacted by the majority in Ireland against the landlords. And even so philosophic a man as my friend Mr. Morley is said to second the idea. With all due respect to these great men, I beg to point out that no surer means of making landlords more odious, if possible, than at present ever entered the human brain. It betrays a positive lack of knowledge of human nature. Give exceptional security or protection or privilege to any class, and it becomes at once a target for the bitter hostility of all other classes. Should unusual guarantees be provided, I venture to predict that instead of healing existing sores, these measures will become the seeds of graver ills to follow. Only what is equal rests in repose and produces good fruit. There cannot be repose, i.e. equilibrium, without equality of the parts. We see the question of a graduated income tax coming to the front in the monarchy. The Republic had this when immense sums were required to meet the cost of the Civil War, but one of the first taxes abandoned at the close of the struggle was the income tax. It was not reduced or made uniform, it was abolished, nor has there ever been a movement to reimpose it. The masses favored its abolition, although it was paid by the few, for all incomes below $2,000, £400, per annum were exempt. I know of no temptation ever placed before a democracy to put the burden of the state upon the shoulders of the few rich citizens, as was contained in the suggestion not to inaugurate a new, but only to resist the repeal of this existing tax. They approved its repeal because it was shown that although theoretically the justice of all modes of taxation, in practice the honest citizen paid it and the dishonest escaped, and that to enforce its honest collection, a thorough system of espionage and minute examination would be required, not in harmony with the spirit of free institutions. The Republican is jealous to a degree of the presence of a government official armed with power to trouble him about anything. Since the Republic adopted the civil service reform, it can no longer be charged that at every change of administration the petty officials lose their places, which never was the case to the extent popularly believed in Britain, for the staff were necessarily retained. I know of no remaining charge against the democracy except international copyright and the alleged corruption of local politics. As before explained, the outs must accuse the ins of corruption, since the policy of the one party is that of the other. There is rarely any other reason for a change to be alleged, but as Matthew Arnold very justly observes, charges of personal corruption in America take the place of personal abuse in Britain, Salisbury being a liar and Gladstone a madman, as these gentlemen are held to be respectively by their most violent opponents. The question arises if American officials, politicians I should say, for the officers of the courts and the Army and Navy are beyond suspicion, if these be venal, where are those who have made fortunes by politics? I have known many hundreds of public men, but scarcely ever one who was not actually poor. When the tenure of office is short, and the chance is great that one of the opposite party will succeed and overhaul all accounts, malfeasance in office must be rare. So it is. Very few defalcations occur. In the case of legislators who may be bribed to vote for measures, it is to be noted that but little private bill legislation is known. A general railway law in the states and general laws by which questions are decided leave but little room for personal aggrandizement. By this means legislation throughout the country is kept substantially pure. Comparing the national legislature at Washington with the British Parliament, I am persuaded that at least as many votes are given from other considerations than those of honest conviction in the latter as in the former. True, the bribe is not the same in both cases. Pecuniary considerations have less weight in the older land, but there is no radical difference whether members' votes are obtained by expected social rank or favor or expected pecuniary gain. A longed-for title, even so poor a one as that of a baronet, is not less a bribe than so many dollars. The nature reached by the dollar may be the lower man of the two, but he is at least not quite so silly. There is more sense in dollars than in titles, patents of nobility, at which the judicious laugh behind the wearer's back, whispering to each other, "Pity the weakness of a poor old man." Viewed thus broadly, there is as much corruption in politics in the mother as in the child land, only its form varies to suit the taste of its victims. End of Chapter 20, Part 1, General Reflections. Chapter 20, Part 2 of Triumphant Democracy by Andrew Carnegie. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Chapter 20, Part 2, General Reflections. The trouble with the Liberal Party in Britain is that it leaks at the top. No sooner does a commoner do good work in Parliament and acquire a position as a Liberal member than he gets a bee in his bonnet. He or his wife and family longs to leave the ranks of the people and receive a title. I know several worthy men who have deliberately sacrificed their proud position as English gentlemen, which is equal to any, to enter the ranks of aristocracy at the very lowest round of the ladder, some of them not even upon the ladder at all. By so doing, they necessarily admit the idea of rank and confess themselves the inferiors of all the other degrees of the class. These men insult the people from which they sprung by leaving them for the aristocracy. By accepting rank, the newly made baronet gives an implied pledge that his earnest liberalism is at an end. He is simply bribed, and henceforth is a muzzled dog. If not, he is a traitor not only to his own class, but to the aristocracy he seeks to enter upon false pretenses. By this sad aberration, the Liberal party is constantly denuded of its able men. A man born in the aristocracy may be respected. A commoner who accepts a new title rarely is, although he may be excused. The query of the old duke, although not upon everybody's lips, is in everybody's thoughts. How shall I treat these new men? They are not noblemen, and they have ceased to be gentlemen. Not until the Liberal is far too proud of his manhood to place himself beneath any order whatever will the Liberal party hold assured sway, or even very greatly deserve to do so. The Republican member could not be paid to change his name. The monarchist will generally pay largely in service for the ornamental appendage. The one is entirely free from all temptations to sacrifice conviction for social position. For this, no government or official can influence in the slightest degree. The other must be possessed of rare independence indeed to escape the corrupting social influences which radiate from monarchical institutions. If we compare the Senate with the House of Lords, the most prejudiced mind must surely grant the palm to the Republican Assembly, for such a spectacle as a body constituting the land-holding class, so completely as to be justly called the House of Landlords, legislating upon land in its own interest, is not seen elsewhere. It is not a rare act for a member of the House in Washington to rise and beg to be excused from voting because his personal interests are affected by a bill. Several presidents of national banks have done so when financial questions were being voted upon. We do not recall the name of any member of the Lords who has refrained from voting upon measures connected with the land. Even the bishops in that assembly may confidently be expected to vote against their coming expulsion instead of asking to be excused to act as public legislators to promote personal ends. I have spoken strongly of the Supreme Court and of the courts in general of the nation. The judiciary of the United States is pure and able and possesses the confidence of the people to a degree equal to that justly reposed by the British people in their judiciary. 30 years ago, a few foreign-born citizens, known as the Tweed Ring, succeeded in casting such reproach upon 2 of the city judges of New York as in the eyes of foreigners to envelop the entire judiciary of the country in a haze of suspicion. And at a later date, a disreputable railway owner, long since dead, corrupted another city judge. Even to this day, I find lingering traces of the bad effects of this in Britain. It is necessary to explain to them that New York City, being then really controlled by the foreign-born vote, it was sometimes easy to elect as city judges very unsuitable material. These, however, it must be noted, were only city magistrates, their decisions being subject to appeal to higher courts. The discovery of this corrupt ring led to prompt corrections. The leader was required to surrender his property, imprisoned in the penitentiary, and died there. Others fled abroad and lived in hiding. Had the people failed to rise and throw party considerations to the winds and sweep away the disgrace, we should indeed have reason to doubt the wisdom of popular institutions. On the contrary, they rose in mass and, incensed beyond measure, swept the rascals from place. Since then, the city government has been comparatively pure. Using the fact that 3 city magistrates in this foreign city of New York had become the tools of a corrupt ring as a foundation for general charges, I have heard people announce that in America the courts were not pure. This has no greater foundation than what I have stated. A moment's reflection will convince one that it would have been impossible for the commercial and manufacturing interests of the nation to develop so enormously were there not in every state pure and incorruptible tribunals to render justice between man and man. The truth is that in settled parts of the Republic, courts of justice are quite as pure as those in corresponding situations in Britain, and justice is much more cheaply and more expeditiously administered. In the semi-civilized territories of the West, where society is beginning to crystallize, there are, of course, all kinds of courts, from the rude but generally strictly just vigilance committee to the improvised judge, who sits upon the plain pine-board bench in his shirt sleeves and has not the strictest ideas of either judicial dignity or integrity. It is of this kind of court that the story is told, of the trial of a man charged with the most heinous of all crimes there, the stealing of a horse, the murder of a man in a street row being insignificant in comparison. The judge asked him if before sentence of death were pronounced he had anything to offer to the court. "Well, Judge," said he, "I haven't much, but if $100 would see me through, I think the boys," looking appealingly around, "would raise it for me." And they would have done so, no doubt, had the judge's words been meant as the prisoner construed them. In due time all this will pass away, and the courts now in the wilds of Dakota or Montana will develop into tribunals as free from suspicion as those which elsewhere grace the settled districts. If a man, knowing both countries well, had, unfortunately, to seek justice through the courts, he would certainly elect to bring his action upon this side of the Atlantic. The verdict would be much more promptly rendered, and the cost much less. In neither land, I make bold to say, would there arise in his mind the faintest suspicion of the honor of the judges who weighed and decided his cause according to the law and the evidence, and this, I submit, is much to say for both branches of the English-speaking race. Throughout this book, my readers will have noted how frequently reference is made to the conservative nature of the political institutions of the Republic, and to the resulting trait of deep and abiding indisposition upon the part of the people to enter upon novel measures or untried fields of legislation. Lord Salisbury's sagacious mind has evidently been struck with all this. The close and critical study of the Constitution and the various branches of the American government, which it has been necessary for me to undertake in the preparation of this book, has not shown me what I did not know before, but I feel bound to say that in a much fuller and clearer light, the conservative character of these have been presented to me, and per contra that the essentially democratic structure of the British Constitution, with which I have naturally compared the former in my progress, has been shown to me in a remarkable degree. The political power of the non-elective monarch being of the past, although the social power is demoralizing upon the character of the people in every respect of its operation, we are face to face with a government without fixity of tenure, and consequently without power as against popular tumult, exposed to every passion of the populace. As long as the populace did not elect the members of Parliament, these were not compelled to give way to their temporary moods, but now, when manhood suffrage practically exists, these members are the servants of the masses and will conform to their every whim. As a staunch Republican with infinite confidence in the voice of the people, one who advocates the election of judges by universal suffrage, and who knows no civil rights which he is not perfectly willing to subject to the will of the majority, I warn the people of Britain that the masses are prone to be carried away temporarily by passion, and that it may be found necessary to interpose some shield between the sudden fierce outburst of an excited population and the officials subjected to the strain, not to thwart the sober judgment of the people, but to give it time to judge. This the Republic has in the fact that its executive and legislative officials are not subject to removal by the popular voice. They serve their appointed term, and they submit for approval or disapproval the results to their masters. With fixity of tenure in office, a Senate of which only 1/3 is changeable each 2 years, and a Supreme Court composed of judges approved by the Senate and holding office for life and retiring upon a pension, by whom all legislative acts are subject to be approved or rendered nugatory, our conservative friends will have no difficulty in reaching the conclusion that so far as security and sound government go, they have strangely missed the truth that the most democratic and ultra-republican community upon earth is much to be envied by the unfortunate supporters of an antiquated monarchical system, which new conditions have robbed of all its virtues, leaving behind only forms bereft of power, to prevent liberty from degenerating into license, popular tumult from overthrowing governments, or to prevent the peaceful enjoyment of property from being ruthlessly disturbed. I speak thus earnestly because I was a sad witness, from an advantageous standpoint, of the supreme weakness of the government in regard to the late Egyptian war, and especially of its virtual abdication of authority in committing to a man wholly unsuited to perform delicate tasks the issue of peace or war in the Sudan, not because he was, in the judgment of the cabinet, the best agent, but because a whiff of manufactured popular opinion seemed for a moment to demand the appointment. In like manner, responsibility for the Sudan has been disclaimed because the popular opinion demanded it. I speak thus, not of any one government or another, liberal or conservative. The evil is in the system. In the Republic, no similar weakness is discernible. The government is secure and can consequently afford to do not what is popular at the moment, but that which will, from its good results, become popular by and by. Some of my radical friends may esteem this strange doctrine for a Republican to preach, but such are yet to learn that the equality of the citizen in a state is the surest antidote for violent revolutionary measures, and brings about in many ways deep and universal solicitude for calm, orderly administration. The privileges enjoyed by the masses are, in their estimation, far too precious to be disturbed. The Republic has seldom elected a popular orator and never elected a public agitator as president. Believe me, the masses are only revolutionary when deprived of equality. Here is the record of 1 century's harvest of democracy. 1. The majority of the English-speaking race under one Republican flag, at peace. 2. The nation which is pledged by act of both parties to offer amicable arbitration for the settlement of international disputes. 3. The nation which contains the smallest proportion of illiterates, the largest proportion of those who read and write. 4. The nation which spends least on war and most upon education, which has the smallest army and navy in proportion to its population and wealth of any maritime power in the world. 5. The nation which provides most generously during their lives for every soldier and sailor injured in its cause, and for their widows and orphans. 6. The nation in which the rights of the minority and of property are most secure. 7. The nation whose flag, wherever it floats over sea and land, is the symbol and guarantor of the equality of the citizen. 8. The nation in whose constitution no man suggests improvement, whose laws as they stand are satisfactory to all citizens. 9. The nation which has the ideal second chamber, the most august assembly in the world, the American Senate. 10. The nation whose Supreme Court is the envy of the ex-Prime Minister of the parent land. 11. The nation whose constitution is the most perfect piece of work ever struck off at one time by the mind and purpose of man, according to the present Prime Minister of the parent land. 12. The nation most profoundly conservative of what is good, yet based upon the political equality of the citizen. 13. The wealthiest nation in the world. 14. The nation first in public credit and in payment of debt. 15. The greatest agricultural nation in the world. 16. The greatest manufacturing nation in the world. 17. The greatest mining nation in the world. Many of these laurels have hitherto adorned the brow of Britain, but her child has wrested them from her. The precocious youth may be tempted to paraphrase Prince Henry's boast to his father and say to the world, quote, "England is but my factor, good my lord, to engross up glorious deeds on my behalf, and I will call her to so strict account that she shall render every glory up." End quote. But please do not be so presumptuous, my triumphant Republican. I do not believe the people of Britain can be beaten in the paths of peaceful triumphs, even by their precocious child. Just wait till you measure yourself with them after they are equally well equipped. There are signs that the masses are about to burst their bonds and be free men. The British race, all equal citizens from birth, will be a very different antagonist to the semi-serfs you have so far easily excelled. Look about you and note that transplanted here and enjoying for a few years similar conditions to yours, the Briton does not fail to hold his own and keep abreast of you in the race. Nor do his children fail either to come to the front. Assuredly, the stuff is in these island mastiffs. It is only improper training and lack of suitable stimulating nourishment, to which their statesmen have subjected them, that renders them feeble. The strain is all right, and the training will soon be all right too. Much has been written upon the relations existing between Old England and New England. It is with deep gratefulness that I can state that never in my day was the regard, the reverence of the child land for the parent land so warm, so sincere, so heartfelt. This was inevitable whenever the pangs of separation ceased to hurt, and the more recent wounds excited by the unfortunate position taken by the mother during the slaveholders' rebellion were duly healed. It was inevitable as soon as the American mind became acquainted with the past history of the race from which he had sprung, and learned the total sum of that great debt which he owed to his progenitor. It is most gratifying to see that the admiration, the love of the American for Britain is in exact proportion to his knowledge and power. It is not the uncultivated man of the Gulch who returns from a visit to the old home filled with pride of ancestry and duly grateful to the pioneer land which in its bloody march towards civil and religious liberty, quote, through the long gorge to the far light hath won its path upward and prevailed, end quote. It is the Washington Irvings, the Nathaniel Hawthornes, the Russell Lowells, the Adamses, the Dudley Warners, the Wentworth Higginsons, the Edward Atkinsons, the men of whom we are proudest at home. Thus, in order that the Republican may love Britain, it is only necessary that he should know her. As this knowledge is yearly becoming more general, affection spreads and deepens. So much for the younger land's share of the question. And now, what are we to testify as to the feelings of the older land toward its forward child? My experience in this matter covers 20 years, in few of which I have failed to visit my native land. I had a hard time of it for the first years, and often had occasion to say to myself, and not a few times to intimate to others, that it was prodigious what these English did not know. I fought the cause of the Union year after year during the rebellion. Only a few of the John Bright class among prominent men, ever and ever our staunchest friends, believed what I often repeated, that, quote, there was not enough of air on the North American continent to float 2 flags, end quote, and that the democracy was firm and true. When the end came and 1 flag was all the air did float, these doubters declared that the immense armies would never disband and retire to the peaceful avocations of life. How little these ignorant people knew of the man who fought for their country. They were soon surprised upon this point. I had to combat upon subsequent visits the general belief in financial circles that it was absurd to hope that a government of the masses would ever think of paying the national debt. It would be repudiated, of course. The danger passed like the first. Then followed prophecies that the greenback dodge would be sanctioned by the people. That passed, too. But well do I remember the difference with which I was received and listened to after these questions had been safely passed, and the Republic had emerged from the struggle, a nation about to assume the front rank among those who had disparaged her. I fear the governing classes at home never thoroughly respected the Republic, and hence could not respect its citizens until it had shown not only its ability to overwhelm its own enemy, but to turn round upon France and with a word drive the monarchical idea out of Mexico. And then it will be remembered that it called to account its own dear parent, who in her official capacity had acted abominably when her own child was in a death struggle with slavery, and asked her to please settle for the injury she had inflicted. This was for a time quite a staggering piece of presumption in the estimation of the haughty old monarchy. But nevertheless, it was all settled by an act which marks an epoch in the history of the race and gives to the 2 divisions of the Anglo-Saxon the proud position of having set the best example of the settlement of international disputes by peaceful arbitration, which the world has yet seen. From this time forth, it became extremely difficult for the privileged classes of Britain to hold up the Republic to the people as a mournful example of the folly of attempting to build up a state without privileged classes. Their hitherto broad charges now necessarily took on the phase of carping criticism. America had not civil service. It turned out all its officials at the beginning of every administration. Well, America got civil service, and that subject was at an end. Then the best people did not enter into political life, and American politicians were corrupt. But the explanation of the first part of the charge, which is quite true as a general proposition, is, as I have shown, that where the laws of a country are perfect in the opinion of a people, and all is going on about to their liking, able and earnest men believe they can serve their fellow men better in more useful fields than politics, which, after all, are but means to an end. "Oh, how dreadful, don't you know," said a young would-be swell to a young American lady. "How dreadful, you know, to be governed by people you would not visit, you know." "Probably," was the reply, "and how delightful, don't you know, to be governed by people who wouldn't visit you." All of the indictments against the Republic have about disappeared except one, and that will soon go as the cause is understood, for international copyright must soon be settled. End of Chapter 20, Part 2, General Reflections. Chapter 20, Part 3 of Triumphant Democracy by Andrew Carnegie. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in October 2020. Triumphant Democracy by Andrew Carnegie, Chapter 20, Part 3. General Reflections. During the period covered by this sketch of my experience, Britons have begun to read and hear more and more about the Republic, and I am happy to say, to run over and see for themselves what the main division of the race is about. The former visitor invariably made the mistake of taking the semi-English, semi-foreign New York City for the country. He had seen most of what was to be seen if he had spent a week or two here. So he thought. But the really able Britons like Morley, Huxley, Froude, Freeman, Farrar, Irving, Rosebery, Bell, Richards, Pigeon, Salt, Rogers, Seeley, Bryce, Spencer, Arnold, and others, who are all personages at home, and many of them personages anywhere, this class knows that until the Allegheny Mountains are crossed, the real native is rarely to be met with. And certainly not unless the visitor has access to the homes of those who figure little or none in political life can he see the best people of the land or understand the foundation of personal worth upon which the state mainly rests. All this these good friends of ours know quite well, and upon the whole I think the Americans may be quite satisfied with the impression they have made upon this class of British visitors. Their reports about America, as far as I have heard them, direct or from those to whom they have been spoken, have ever been flattering, so that today I believe the affection with which the Republic regards the old land is in a fair way to be reciprocated. When the example of a nation is quoted by the leading men of another in grave crises as the best means of rousing their own people to creditable action, we may safely infer that its position in their esteem is at least secure. The instances in which the Republic is nowadays called upon to serve as the inspirer of the old land are too numerous to mention, but only last evening I read a speech made by Mr. Chamberlain, who was certainly nearer to the premiership of Britain than anyone except Mr. Gladstone, from which I extract the following. Quote, "To preserve the Union, the northern states of America poured out their blood and treasure like water, and fought and won the contest of our time. And if Englishmen still possess the courage and stubborn determination which were so lately the ancient characteristics of the race, and which were so conspicuous in the great American contest, we shall allow no temptation and no threat to check our resolution to maintain unimpaired the effective union of the three kingdoms that owe allegiance to the present sovereign." End quote. Note the if, my fellow citizens. If Englishmen still possess the courage and stubborn determination which were so conspicuous in the great American contest. Americans have been praised for their energy, their devotion to education and to religion, their inventiveness, their resolute payment of debt, and for other qualities. But who could have believed that a leading statesman of Britain would cite their high courage and stubbornness to the old bulldog race of Britons? Mr. Chamberlain, however, in my opinion, does the original race injustice. Men decreed by the laws of a state unworthy at birth to be equal citizens thereof have no reason to fight very hard and sacrifice much for its maintenance. Give them the rights of the American, my dear Mr. Chamberlain, and you will then see in Britain what patriotism means. There is not yet in Britain a government of the people, but a government and the people. Government is always thought of by the masses as something not of, but apart and above themselves. Americans may not be able to understand this, but it is quite natural in a country where government is based on the idea that its head springs from a higher source than the voice of the people and is beyond their control, descending from parent to child by right of birth. Yet so advanced a man as Mr. Chamberlain, it will be observed, speaks of the three kingdoms which owe allegiance to the sovereign. He does not seem to realize that just as long as the people owe allegiance to anybody but themselves, so long will he look in vain to his countrymen for the love and devotion to their country which is found in the breasts of Americans for theirs. They have not equal reason to love the land which gave them birth. The Republic honors her children at birth with equality. The monarchy stamps hers with the brand of inferiority. The following from the most powerful liberal organ in Britain, The Spectator, December 26, 1885, also invokes the action of the Republic as an example for the original race. Quote, "Democracy ought to be strongest of all in its insistency that properly represented parts of the body corporate shall not set the body corporate at defiance and set up for themselves. It was found equal to the strength of purpose in the United States, and we trust that it will be found equal to it in the United Kingdom. The trial was severe and the conflict was long, but the tenacity of the democracy triumphed at last. We believe that it will be so with us. If we show indecision, if we show weakness, if we show that the spirit of determination to put down the secessionist tendencies of the day is not high within us, we shall undoubtedly be giving the first serious signal of national decay. We do not believe that it will be so. We believe that Great Britain, directly the situation comes out clearly before her, will nerve herself to as strenuous a policy as that which secured the integrity of the American nation in the great crisis of 1861. End quote. Democracy was found equal in the United States, and we trust it will be found equal in the United Kingdom. The democracy triumphed, and we believe it will be so with us. We believe that Great Britain will nerve herself to as strenuous a policy as that which secured the integrity of the American nation in the great crisis of 1861. If the old land, you see, only comes up to the standard set by the new, it is all that is even hoped for. But under monarchical institutions, it is impossible they can ever reach the standard. Monarchical institutions emasculate men, the masses, in greater degree. But even in public life today in Britain, there is probably not a man of the rank of a cabinet minister, no, not one, but would have bowed, and that low and repeatedly, if desired, to Gessler's cap, and smiled to think he had done himself no injury by so doing, since it was not a practical question. Of course, men can kiss the hand of the Queen, as one is proud to kiss the hand of any good woman, but how will it be when the Prince of Wales holds out his hand, and Messrs. Chamberlain and Morley, Collins and Broadhurst, Trevelyan and Fowler, and others are required to kiss that? I am not sure but that even these radicals may find it no strain upon their manhood to incur this degradation. But the first man who feels as he ought to feel will either smile when the hand is extended at the suggestion that he could so demean himself, or give it a good hearty shake, or knock his Royal Highness down. I have heard of ladies of high rank who say they never would kiss the prince's hand, but they need not trouble themselves upon this score, for the prince will make himself immensely popular by reversing the process and kissing their hands instead. He is a gallant gentleman. It is not the man we declaim against, but the effect of the customs fit only for serfs by which monarchy is surrounded, and which tend to keep men, even radicals, subservient. The masses of Britain always have been and are now with the Republic to the core. Their warmest sympathies and intensest admiration are bestowed upon the Republic. This sentiment has already reached the educated liberals. The more pronounced the liberalism, the more affectionately is the freer land regarded. The position of the country in its recent amazing strides, the peace and content which everywhere prevail, and beyond all the regard for law and order and for the rights of property, the unmistakable conservatism of the American people on which I have dwelt, are fast making a decided impression upon the hitherto timid and misbelieving but educated people of the Conservative Party. They cannot quite account for it, and are not yet open to the truth that political institutions, which make all citizens equal, necessarily produce the virtues which I have recounted. But as no other explanation is seemingly possible, we may soon expect them to advance to its admission. Tory democracy may not then be an apparent misnomer after all. I should like Americans to observe how rapidly the thinkers of Europe are discovering the merits of their institutions and example. Several of Britain's foremost men have recently visited the country. The historian Freeman came first. Listen to what he says. Quote, "Your Constitution, above all, has gone through the most frightful of trials, and it has stood the test. I remember 20 years ago how shallow people were crying out that the principle of a federal system was proved to be worthless because certain members of a particular confederation wished to separate from it. I can only suppose that they fancied that no revolts, no separations, no dismemberments had ever taken place in the lands governed by kings. The retort is so obvious that I need hardly point out that the recent experience of Greece, of Belgium, of Poland, of Lombardy, of Sicily, of half a dozen European lands, proved at least as much against monarchy as the secession of the southern states proved against federalism. At all events, they did not stop to think that, after all, they were only backing up one federal commonwealth against another. They must have shut their eyes to the fact that the Southern Confederacy, in its short-lived Constitution, reenacted all the essential features of the Constitution of the United States. The fact is one which I should turn about in another way. I can conceive no more speaking tribute to the wisdom of any political system than the fact that the men who were most dissatisfied with its actual administration, the men who were most anxious to escape from its actual fellowship, of set purpose reenacted its chief provisions for their own separate use." End quote. Mr. Freeman was followed by their foremost literary man, Mr. Matthew Arnold. Here is his conclusion. Quote, "As one watches the play of the Americans' institutions, the image suggests itself to one's mind of a man in a suit of clothes which fits him to perfection, leaving all his movements unimpeded and easy. It is loose where it ought to be loose, and it sits close where its sitting close is an advantage. The central government of the United States keeps in its own hands those functions which, if the nation is to have real unity, ought to be kept there. Those functions it takes to itself and no others. The state governments and the municipal governments provide people with the fullest liberty of managing their own affairs, and afford besides a constant and invaluable school of practical experience. This wonderful suit of clothes, again to recur to our image, is found also to adapt itself naturally to the wearer's growth, and to admit of all enlargements as they successively arise." End quote. The third of the trio is the historian, Mr. Froude, and here is his verdict. Quote, the problem of how to combine a number of self-governed communities into a single commonwealth, which now lies before Englishmen who desire to see a federation of the empire, has been solved, and solved completely, in the American Union. The bond which at the Declaration of Independence was looser than that which now connects Australia and England became strengthened by time and custom. The attempt to break it was successfully resisted by the sword, and the American Republic is, and is to continue, so far as reasonable foresight can anticipate, one, and henceforth indissoluble. Each state is free to manage its own private affairs, to legislate for itself, subject to the fundamental laws of the Union, and to administer its own internal government, with this reservation only, that separation is not to be thought of. The right to separate was settled once for all by a civil war which startled the world by its magnitude, but which, terrible though it might be, was not disproportioned to the issues which were involved. Had the South succeeded in winning independence, the cloth once rent would have been rent again. There would not have been one America, but many Americas. The New World would have trodden over again in the tracks of the old. There would have been rival communities with rival constitutions, democracies passing into military despotisms, standing armies, intrigues and quarrels, and wars upon wars. The completeness with which the issue has been accepted shows that Americans understood the alternative that lay before them. That the wound so easily healed was a proof that they had looked the alternative in the face and were satisfied with the verdict which had been pronounced. And well may they be satisfied. The dimensions and value of any single man depends on the body of which he is a member. As any individual, with his horizon bounded by his personal interests, he remains, however high his gifts, but a mean creature. His thoughts are small, his aims narrow, he has no common concerns or common convictions which bind him to his fellows. He lives, he works, he wins a share, small or great, of the necessaries or luxuries which circumstances throw within his reach, and then he dies, and there is an end of him. A man, on the other hand, who is more than himself, who is part of an institution, who has devoted himself to a cause, or is a citizen of an imperial power, expands to the scope and fullness of the larger organism. And the grander the organization, the larger and more important the unit that knows that he belongs to it. His thoughts are wider, his interests less selfish, his ambitions ampler and nobler. As a granite block is to the atoms of which it is composed when disintegrated, so are men in organic combination to the same men only aggregated together. Each particle contracts new qualities which are created by the intimacy of union. Individual Jesuits are no more than other mortals. The Jesuits as a society are not mortal at all, and rule the Catholic world. Behind each American citizen, America is standing, and he knows it, and is the man that he is because he knows it. The Anglo-Americans divided might have fared no better than the Spanish colonies. The Anglo-Americans united command the respectful fear of all mankind, and as Pericles said of the Athenians, each unit of them acts as if the fortunes of his country depended only on himself. A great nation makes great men, a small nation makes little men. We have also as recent witness the English writer Mackenzie, author of the remarkable History of the 19th Century and an excellent work on America. Here is the last paragraph of his work. America has still something to learn from the riper experience and more patient thinking of England, but it has been her privilege to teach to England and the world one of the grandest of lessons. She has asserted the political rights of the masses. She has proved to us that it is safe and wise to trust the people. She has taught that the government of the people should be by the people and for the people. Let our last word here be a thankful acknowledgment of the inestimable service which she has thus rendered to mankind." End quote. And finally, we have Sir Henry Maine's Popular Government, a work at which we must often smile, for Sir Henry is sorely afraid of democracy and charges popular government with all the ups and downs of the Spanish republics of South America and the French Republic, and never, seemingly, stops to ask himself how these communities have gone on, or how they would go on, were the rule of a class tried by them, how France did under the monarchy of the Empire, for instance. Nevertheless, when he comes to the American Constitution, he gives us pages of favorable comment and closes his book with these remarkable words. Quote, "The powers and disabilities attached to the United States and to the several states by the federal Constitution and placed under the protection of the deliberately contrived securities we have described have determined the whole course of American history. That history began, as all its records abundantly show, in a condition of society produced by war and revolution, which might have condemned the great Northern Republic to a fate not unlike that of her disorderly sisters in South America. But the provisions of the Constitution have acted on her like those dams and dikes which strike the eye of the traveler along the Rhine, controlling the course of a mighty river which begins amid mountain torrents, and turning it into one of the most equable waterways in the world. When the American Constitution was framed, there was no such sacredness to be expected for it, as before 1789 was supposed to attach to all parts of the British Constitution. There was every prospect of political mobility, if not of political disorder. The signal success of the Constitution of the United States in stemming these tendencies is, no doubt, owing in part to the great portion of the British institutions which were preserved in it, but it is also attributable to the sagacity with which the American statesmen filled up the interstices left by the inapplicability of certain of the then existing British institutions to the emancipated colonies. This sagacity stands out in every part of the Federalist, and it may be tracked in every page of subsequent American history. It may well fill the Englishmen who live in Facia Romula with wonder and envy." End quote. So, my fellow Republicans, the world is coming rapidly to your feet. The American Constitution is being more and more generally regarded as the model for all new nations to adopt and for all old nations to strive for. As I have said in a previous chapter, Americans need not expect the aristocracy ever to regard with other than prejudiced mind and vindictive hate a state which flaunts in their faces the truth that their existence is a positive injury to the nation upon which they feed like parasites. How can a peer of Britain, who is not more of a man than a peer, which few of them are, how can he have the slightest wish for the prosperity of a nation which would not tolerate his existence as a peer within its bounds? If any man believe that Queen Victoria or the Prince of Wales or Kaiser William or any member of a royal family could receive more welcome news than that of the downfall of the Republic, which proves every hour to the parent lands that these royal people are only excrescences upon the state, the setters of bad example, and the very core around which the worst vices of English life gather and fester, if anyone can believe this, his estimate of human nature differs from mine. There is not a crowned head in the world, nor a member of a royal family, who could refrain from secretly rejoicing at any disaster which would befall a republic, and the joy would be in proportion to the magnitude of the disaster. This is not at all to be wondered at. Indeed, it is obviously inevitable, and I must confess that when I hear of the downfall of any hereditary privilege, I croon to myself and am happy. No message so sweet. I have my revenge. The overthrow of a monarchy and the birth of a republic, as in the case of France, is a perfect wellspring of joy to my heart. I fancy there are few Americans who are not equally delighted. Then let them know and understand that with a bitter hate is the Republic hated by the royal families and aristocrats, no matter how well they may dissemble and appear to wish it well for policy's sake. Let but the Republic be in danger, and it will soon see how ready they are to stab it from behind. Fortunately, their power to injure grows less and less, and even today is quite impotent to arrest the constantly increasing volumes of genuine admiration and affection with which this country is regarded by all but this small, noxious class, which is rapidly fading away. The assimilation of the political institutions of the two countries proceeds apace by the action of the older in the direction of the newer land. Year after year, some difference is obliterated. Yesterday, it was an extension of the suffrage. Today, it is universal and compulsory education. Tomorrow, the joining of law and equity. And the next day, it will be the abolition of primogeniture and entail. A few years more, and all that remains of feudalistic times will have disappeared, and the political institutions of the two divisions will be practically the same, with only such slight variations of structure as adapt them to the slightly varying conditions by which they are surrounded. It has been and is my chief ambition to do what little I can, if anything, to hasten this process, that the two divisions may thereby be brought more closely into unison, that the bonds between my dear native land and my beloved adopted land may be strengthened and drawn more tightly together. For sure am I, who am in part the child of both, and whose love for the one and the other is as the love of man for mother and wife, sure am I that the better these grand divisions of the British race know each other, the stronger will grow the attachment between them, and just as sure am I that in their genuine affection and indissoluble alliance lies the best hopes for the elevation of the human race. God grant, therefore, that the future of my native and adopted lands may fulfill the hope of the staunchest, ablest, and most powerful friend of this land, and the great commoner of his own, that although they may be two nations, they may be but one people. Thus spake John Bright, and echoing once more that fond hope, I lay down my pen and bid my readers on both sides of the Atlantic farewell. End of Chapter 20, General Reflections, and end of Triumphant Democracy, by Andrew Carnegie.